Hey guys, tonight we set out across a horizon that is more dust than sky, where the air feels heavy and baked, and where your shoes, or let's be honest, the sandals you probably regretted wearing, collect fine red powder that never truly washes out. You stand in a West African village long before the conveniences of air conditioning or even a decent umbrella. The sun is relentless, almost smug in how it glares down, and you feel the heat not just above, but radiating from every wall, every patch of earth beneath you. This is the world of mud brick builders, quiet craftspeople who shaped homes from the same soil they walked upon. You might picture skyscrapers or gleaming glass towers as symbols of architectural genius. But here, in this place, mud and patience are the real wonders. And yes, reality check. You probably wouldn't last one afternoon mixing clay under that merciless sun without fainting dramatically into a pile of half-formed bricks. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move through the heat haze, your eyelids a little heavy not just from the warmth, but from the rhythm of village life around you. People shuffle calmly, children dart barefoot through patches of shade, and there's a sound that's not quite music, but not quite silence either. The slap of wet clay, the shuffle of straw, the distant call of someone bargaining for millet. One thing about mud brick villages is their almost magical resilience. You might assume that houses made of earth would melt away at the first hint of rain, yet here you are, surrounded by buildings that have endured decades, sometimes centuries of seasonal storms. The trick lies in the balance. Too much water in the mix and your bricks sag like badly baked cookies. Too little and they crumble before you even lift them. Builders learned this by instinct, not blueprints. Historians still argue whether the earliest builders across the Niger Bend figured it out through trial and error, or whether knowledge traveled down family lines like an heirloom recipe. Except instead of cookies, it's clay walls that don't fall on your head. As you trail a group of workers toward an open patch of ground, you notice the pits dug into the earth. They're filled with clay-rich soil, water, and heaps of straw that almost look edible if you squint too long on an empty stomach. The builders step inside barefoot, stomping like they're rehearsing a sleepy dance routine. Your own feet twitch sympathetically, though you're grateful you don't actually have to join. The sensation you imagine is part mud spa, part boot camp punishment. A mainstream historical fact: in many West African regions, particularly along the Niger River, these adobe traditions date back over 1,000 years, tied to both domestic homes and monumental mosques like the one in Djenné. The soil beneath your toes is quite literally history in progress. A child nearby laughs at your grimacing face because apparently you do not look graceful standing near the mud pits. You wave back with exaggerated dignity, pretending that of course you meant to look awkward. That's part of your charm. Light joke number one successfully delivered to yourself. The builders scoop the mixed mud into wooden molds, pressing it down with firm but unhurried hands. Then comes the patient part. The bricks are slid out to bake under the sun. No roaring kilns, no billowing smoke, just day after day of slow drying. It feels almost like waiting for bread dough to rise, except the oven is a merciless sky that doesn't switch off. You pass rows of bricks, their surfaces drying to a crust while their centers still hold dampness. You run your fingers across one. It leaves a faint smear like chocolate on warm hands, though sadly less delicious. Quirky tidbit. In some communities, people whispered small blessings or even pressed fingerprints into bricks as subtle charms. Imagine moving into your house and knowing your wall has your grandmother's literal handprint in it. You glance around now, half expecting to see faces leaning down, whispering into each clay mold as though confiding secrets. No one is doing that today, but you like the thought. The village expands around you in earth tones, yet it feels far from monotonous. Patterns emerge, geometric designs pressed into walls, niches carved into corners, sometimes a splash of whitewash that reflects just enough light to make an entrance inviting. You duck into the shade of one nearly finished home. The temperature drops instantly and you sigh audibly. Yes, you're that person making the dramatic ah noise in front of strangers. Someone snickers. You're basically the entertainment for this work site. But the comfort is real. Mud brick houses keep interiors cool even when the outside feels like a frying pan. Historians still argue whether the precise thickness of walls evolved mainly from trial and error comfort testing, or from symbolic traditions of sturdiness. Either way, the result is practical. Thick earthen walls that act like natural air conditioners, long before anyone invented the whirring box you rely on. You lean against one, enjoying the fact that for once leaning doesn't involve sweating against sun-heated stone or metal. From your spot, you observe another curious feature: roofs made of timber beams layered with packed earth. The beams are not always easy to source. Trees can be scarce in some regions, which means cooperation between villages or long treks for wood. Picture yourself hauling logs across sandy ground while also trying not to think about the scorpions hiding underneath. Joke number two, because really, if one stung you, your main legacy would be collapsing dramatically into someone's half-built kitchen. Beyond the structures, the social rhythm fascinates you. Building isn't a solitary job, it's communal. Neighbors help neighbors, families work together, and children sneak in to stomp mud just for fun. You might grumble about assembling flat-pack furniture alone in your living room, but here construction is closer to a festival. Songs rise with the sun, rhythmic clapping echoes, and you catch one elder humming what sounds suspiciously like a lullaby while smoothing a wall. You're half tempted to join in, except your singing voice is the kind that clears birds out of trees. Still, the sense of continuity is undeniable. You realize that while modern skyscrapers often symbolize progress, these earthen homes symbolize survival of climate, of culture, of community. Mainstream fact. Archaeologists have found evidence of mud brick structures in West Africa lasting hundreds of years, with constant maintenance and renewal keeping them alive far longer than you'd expect from something that looks at first glance so fragile. The air grows drowsy, cicadas buzzing like a background soundtrack designed to lull. You find yourself tracing the outline of a wall with your hand, feeling the grooves where straw peeks through, smelling faint earthiness rising in the heat. You don't just see the architecture, you feel it in texture, in sound, in rhythm. Scholars may argue endlessly about whether techniques arrived with trans-Saharan trade or were born independently here. But you know what your skin tells you. This is craftsmanship that works, however it began. Your mind wanders for a moment. You imagine your own house back wherever you came from, rebuilt in this style. Would your neighbors appreciate walls that need replastering after a heavy storm? Probably not. But you would definitely appreciate never having an electricity bill again. Joke number 3. You chuckle under your breath, and someone nearby mistakes it for agreement with their joke in another language. You nod politely. Let's be real. You're not going to ruin the vibe by confessing you were laughing at your own imagined utility savings. The sun dips slightly lower, shadows stretching like tired cats. The workers don't rush. Time here is measured not by clocks, but by the pace of drying bricks, the arc of light across rooftops, the weight of cool evening air sneaking in. You feel your own body aligning with that rhythm, slower, calmer, almost as though the mud itself is whispering. Settle down. No need to hurry. By the time a soft breeze stirs dust around your ankles, you're no longer just an observer. You're woven into this patient choreography. You know that tomorrow, more bricks will dry, more walls will rise, and more shade will shelter children darting barefoot past. And you also know you'll still be here, trudging along, trying not to look too ridiculous in front of builders who make timeless houses out of nothing more than dirt, water, and care. You wander out toward the low banks of a muddy river, sandals sinking into the warm clay that clings to your feet like sticky dough. The air is heavy, humid, carrying a faint metallic smell from the wet earth. Every step makes a quiet squelch, like walking across an oversized loaf of bread, still cooling from the oven. That smell? That's your main building material waiting to be scooped up. Mud. Not glamorous, not flashy, but in the right hands and with the right mix, it turns into the very walls of villages that have stood longer than some modern cities, managed before collapsing into potholes. You crouch and drag your fingers through the slick surface. The mud here is not just dirt mixed with water, it has weight, density, a soft elasticity when squeezed. Experienced builders in West Africa could test the quality with nothing more than a handful and a glance. Too sandy and your house crumbles like a sad shortbread cookie. Too clay rich and your wall cracks as it dries. The perfect balance is like catching the exact point between undercooked and burnt toast. You know it when you see it, and your grandmother would probably scold you if you get it wrong. Villagers usually gather clay in the early morning before the sun turns the ground into a frying pan. Donkeys with baskets, or sometimes just lines of people with clay smeared up their arms, ferry the raw material to the building site. It looks messy, and it is, but there's an unspoken rhythm to the work. Children sometimes jump into the muck, squealing, treating it like an improvised water park. You, however, are here to learn, not to splash. Unless you want a firm lecture about wasting building material, which, let's be honest, would be the least fun way to ruin your evening. Now comes the straw. Not the plastic kind that earns angry hashtags on social media, but dried stalks of sorghum, millet, or rice left over after harvest. These brittle stalks are more than filler. They're reinforcement, natural rebar. Without them, the clay bricks shrink and crack. With them, you get walls that flex just enough to hold shape during hot days and cool nights. Ancient eco-engineers figured this out long before the term eco-friendly was something people put on coffee packaging. Picture women and men bending over piles of straw, snapping it into shorter fibers. The sound is crisp, like dry spaghetti breaking in your hands. They scatter it onto the mud heap, then fold everything together with shovels or bare feet. Yes, feet. You shuffle into the pit, ankle deep, pressing down again and again. The mud resists, then yields, oozing between your toes. It's gross, it's oddly satisfying, and it's historically accurate. Some modern tourists actually pay money for mud therapy spas. Here, it's free. though nobody's handing you cucumber water while you work. A quirky little fact surfaces. In certain regions, builders occasionally mixed in not only straw, but also dung, cow, donkey, or even crocodile. Yes, crocodile. Supposedly it added strength and kept pests away. Historians still argue whether that trick worked scientifically or if it was more symbolic. A way of folding the animal's feared power into your home. Either way, it gives new meaning to the idea of living in a house with character. You'd probably want a lot of incense around. While you stomp and stir, you start noticing the rhythm of labor. Step, squish, fold. Step, squish, fold. It's meditative in its own messy way, almost like those yoga classes where people stretch to whale songs and call it enlightenment. Except here, enlightenment comes with mud stuck under your toenails. A builder might crack a joke about whether the spirits prefer left foot stomps or right foot stomps. Another might hum a slow song, the melody blending with the squelch of the clay. This is labor, yes, but also ritual. As the pile grows smooth and uniform, you feel the weight of tradition in your legs. The mud and straw mixture has been prepared this way for centuries, passed along not through textbooks but through calloused hands and sore muscles. When an elder leans over and says, "That's enough water," you trust them. Too much water and your bricks collapse, too little and they refuse to mold. Again, the sweet spot, like Goldilocks, except instead of porridge, you're taste-testing sludge. You watch a boy dart off with a calabash bowl to fetch water from the river. Each splash into the pit makes the mixture darker, slicker, shinier. The smell deepens, earthy, wet, almost metallic. The heat of the day bakes down, sweat rolling across your back, but you keep going. Mud doesn't wait. If it dries before shaping, all the stomping goes to waste. Builders joke about how mud is like an impatient guest. It needs to be hosted right away or it storms off. Mainstream history drops in here. The Great Mosque of Djenné, in present-day Mali, still considered the largest mud brick building in the world, was built and rebuilt using precisely this technique. Every year, entire communities gather to renew its walls with fresh mud, treating it both as maintenance and festival. Think of it as a medieval neighborhood paint and sip event, except with more mud and fewer overpriced wine glasses. You pause and glance up at the horizon. A herd of goats ambles by, eyeing the straw with suspicion, because to them it looks suspiciously edible. A woman waves them away with her scarf, muttering something about goats ruining good construction. Everyday annoyances, timeless as ever. It's oddly comforting to realize that even centuries ago, people were side-eyeing livestock the way you might glare at a pigeon trying to steal your sandwich. Scholarly debate slides in too. Some researchers argue that straw in the bricks wasn't merely practical, it may have carried symbolic meaning. Grain was life. To embed its stalks in your walls might have been a quiet way of blessing the house, ensuring the fertility of fields and family alike. Others push back, saying it was just convenient recycling, like turning cereal boxes into storage bins. Either way, your toes keep stomping and your calves start aching. Symbolism or not, you're still ankle-deep in goo. As the mixture finally reaches the right consistency, firm yet pliable, you scoop a handful, lift it to your nose, and sniff. It smells like wet earth after rain, sharp and raw. There's no mistaking it. This is the stuff of shelter. It doesn't glisten like marble, it doesn't clang like steel, but it promises warmth on cool nights and shade on scorching afternoons. If you had to pick a superpower for mud, it would be ordinary but undefeated. Someone calls out. The pile is ready. The tools come out. Wooden molds, simple rectangular frames set at the ground. It's nearly time to shape bricks. For now, though, you step out of the pit, scraping mud from your legs, and glance back at the mound you've helped create. It sits heavy, patient, waiting to be transformed. You catch yourself thinking, in a world where everyone chases gleaming glass skyscrapers, here stands a recipe so basic it fits in your palm. Mud, water, straw. Yet it has outlasted droughts, storms, even empires. And you? You're just another pair of muddy feet in a chain that stretches back 1,000 years. It's messy, it's exhausting, it's oddly poetic. The sun slides lower, shadows stretch across the fields, and you feel the day's weight settle into your shoulders. Still, there's satisfaction in knowing that tomorrow, when the mixture is pressed into molds, it will begin its slow transformation into walls. Walls that can outlive you. Maybe even walls that future historians will still argue about. Was that crocodile dung really necessary? Nobody knows for sure. You step into the pit and the mud greets your feet with a cool, clinging surprise. And for a second you consider whether you should have read the receipt that came with your sandals. The earth here has a weight and a smell. Wet silt, old grass, the faint metallic tang of river. An honest scent that tells you without pretense what it wants to become. Around you the site is alive in low domestic noise. A woman humming as she chops straw, a child calling out a score to a game, an elder giving a dry, approving grunt at the way someone presses a mold. You take a breath, plant your feet, and begin. Mixing mud by foot and hand is almost absurdly simple, and yet the simplicity is deceptive. You set your heels, shift to the balls of your feet, and then the toes, repeating the motion until it becomes a steady, meditative rhythm. Heel, ball, toe, heel. The motion compacts the mixture, forces water into the clay matrix, folds the straw through the mass. An elder laughs and calls it the village's least graceful dance. You laugh back. You probably will not win any choreography awards, but the joke is part of the rhythm, and it settles the muscles that are learning a craft. Joke 1. The recipe is modest. Clay-rich topsoil, measured water, chopped straw, and sometimes small local additives. Straw is not decoration. It is tiny tensile reinforcement, fibers that refuse to let a drying brick split apart. Mainstream historical fact? Sun-dried mud bricks reinforced with organic fiber have been a backbone of Sahelian architecture for well over 1,000 years, supporting both ordinary homes and monumental constructions. The Great Mosque of Djenné being one of the best-known examples where the same basic materials and maintenance rituals have sustained a community's architecture across centuries. The method feels humble, but it is proven. As you stomp, you learn to read the mud. Too much sand makes the mix brittle. Too much pure clay invites dramatic shrinkage cracks as the brick dries. Add too much water, and the whole lot slumps like a failed soufflé. Add too little, and you get a crumbly mix that refuses to form. The experienced builders call corrections like a midwife calls contractions. By feel, by sound, by smell. Historians still argue whether particular villages guarded exact ratios as secret family knowledge, or whether recipes diffused widely through trade and seasonal migration. From where you stand, the truth looks like both. Pockets of local recipes braided into broader traditions. Quirky practices surface between the pragmatic ones. Someone mentions with a conspiratorial grin, That in a hamlet upriver, a mason once mixed crushed pottery shards into the mud and swore it improved the brick's bite against erosion. Another chuckles about a story, half serious, half teasing, of dung being used as an additive. Crocodile dung gets named as the most dramatic example, mainly to provoke belly laughs. These anecdotes sit at the intersection of practice and myth. Sometimes pragmatic experiments, sometimes local bravado. Historians still argue whether such additives were widespread technical adaptations or localized traditions wrapped in cultural meaning. Either way, the stories flavor the work like pepper and stew. When you scoop the mixture into a wooden mold, simple rectangular frames the size of a thick book, you feel oddly like a potter. Pack, press, level? Those are the verbs that matter. A neighbor taps the side and gives the mold a practiced knock to judge compaction. Pull back the form and a neat brick appears, raw and stubborn. You place it on a drying rack under the sun, and the stack begins. There is a small, profoundly domestic pride in watching a pile of your own work accumulate. 4, 8, 20 bricks stacked in neat rows. You imagine them translated into a wall that will one day shade someone's cooking pot, protect a sleeping child, keep out the particular small anxieties that rain and wind bring. This work is social in every sense. Children weave between drying bricks like they're performing an obstacle course. Women balance calabashes of water on their heads with an effortless grace that humbles you. Elders sit and issue short, corrective comments that sound to you like pure poetry. More water, press softer, turn it now, and the apprentices respond. Gender roles exist, but they are porous. Anyone who masters a technique finds themselves invited to contribute. You learn more from these small exchanges than from any single tutorial. There's an apprenticeship that happens without a written manual. Hands teaching hands. Drying is an art of patience and placement. Bricks are rotated so that each face catches a fair share of sun and breeze. If one side dries faster than another, it warps and sabotages the batch. If clouds gather unexpectedly, reed mats or tarps are thrown as emergency covers. The weather becomes a collaborator you watch closely. Some builders read humidity and wind patterns like sailors read currents. The process teaches you a peculiar local meteorology. You begin to feel clouds in your bones and learn why building seasons matter. There is also ritual sewn into maintenance. In towns that hold on to old ways, communal replastering of important buildings becomes a festival. Ladders are lent, drums might sound, and neighbors climb and smear mud on walls together. The Great Mosque's annual renewal is a spectacular example. Families bring ladders and paddles, children scurry, elders issue commands with affection, and the city rebonds through shared labor. Historians still argue about how and when some of these communal rituals solidified into the cycles we see today, but they are spectacular proof that construction can be social glue rather than just an industrial process. The economy of material is quiet and impressive. Failed bricks get crushed and recycled. Ash shell fragments or crushed stones are added to tune texture and abrasion resistance. Nothing is wasted here in the way modern building sometimes expels its errors into landfills. An elder shows you how to crush a ruined block between two stones and says with a smile, "Even our mistakes feed the next house." And you realize that the saying is literal. Social favors operate similarly. You help a neighbor plaster today, and when the rains come and your roof pleads, they will be there. You practice a fold and press technique until your hands remember the exact motion. The first attempts look messy and lopsided. The fourth or fifth feels like revelation. The material aligns, the straw nestles, trapped air leaves, and the mold yields a brick that holds its shape with a satisfying dignity. Some masons here become quietly famous. Their walls require less frequent attention. They patch more economically, and their houses seem to stand against weather with that confident stubbornness you want in an old friend. Skill is visible in longevity. As afternoon slides to evening, baskets of mixed paste are carried to the molding area, usually balanced on heads with the balance you do not have yet. You try it and wobble. A neighbor laughs and dubs your stance the tourist yoga pose, which is kind and not untrue. Joke 2. Their gait, practiced over years, saves energy and prevents injuries. It appears to you almost choreographed by necessity. Elders test slabs by tapping and listening. Their ears distinguish subtleties that mean nothing to you at first and everything to them. A satisfied nod means the batch will build a true line of wall. A frown means you mix again tomorrow. Failure is not shameful, it is useful. The process is iterative, resilient, and communal by design. You rinse the mud from your feet in a shallow trough as the sky cools, watching the water run brown and slow, carrying the day downstream. Tea is poured. Stories are told about past repairs that involved stubborn oxen or unexpected storms, and laughter threads through the dusk. You leave with clay under your nails, your breath steadier, your shoulders looser. The mud follows you a bit on your clothes, but it follows more importantly into your senses, a tactile memory stamped into you. You have not simply mixed material, you have joined a lineage of hands that turn soil into shelter through patience, song, and the unglamorous essential habit of returning errors to the mix. You lift your gaze and the village rearranges itself. What was a scatter of low houses becomes a skyline of warm clay and projecting timbers, a mosque rising out of the same earth you have been stomping and shaping. It does not glitter like marble, nor does it boast iron or glass, but it makes a declaration all the same. This is a place we build together visibly and with hands. Timber beams jut at intervals from the facade like regular ribs, each one worn smooth at the end where decades of hands and feet have climbed, hung baskets, and left small notches of use. Those beams are not decorative afterthoughts. They are part ladder, part signature, part invitation. Moving closer, you notice the mosque's surfaces are sculpted in ways that seem to soften the sun. Niches and fluted buttresses cast long shadows, and the building reads as a sequence of tactile planes rather than a flat wall. This architecture is optimized for climate, for ritual, and for repair. When the rains come, the contours shear water away. When the heat presses, the thick clay mass stores warmth and releases it slowly, smoothing temperature swings for the people inside. You run your hand across a patch of recently replastered surface and feel how layers of work sit like thin blankets on older blankets. Each coat a season, each coat a story. Hold this simple fact in your mind. Monumental mud brick mosques have been central to urban life in Sahelian towns for centuries, and their survival depends on repeated community maintenance. The Great Mosque of Djenné is the clearest example, the largest adobe structure often pointed to in conversations about earthen architecture. And it is remade by hand on a regular schedule. What you're looking at, then, is as much process as product. The mosque is not finished so much as continuously tended. That rhythm of remaking is what keeps this architecture alive where other things might crumble. You circle the building and see human scale built into the design. Those projecting wooden beams, called toron in many places, give masons a place to stand and to climb without erecting separate scaffolding. Watching workers balance on them, passing lumps of mud and plaster in a practiced choreography, you realize the architecture anticipates its own maintenance. That practical foresight is quietly beautiful. The building expects to be repaired, and so it invites repair in its form. It's the architectural equivalent of a sweater that includes spare yarn in the seams. Step inside, and the air is hushed in the most restful way. Light filters in through high, narrow windows and falls in muted bands across the packed earth floor. Voices and footsteps are softened. Prayers rise and settle easily without bouncing into cavernous echoes. Ornament here is subtle. Painted lintels, carved wooden doors, small painted panels where color brightens a niche. The space feels intimate rather than monumental, an interior designed for congregation and conversation rather than for dramatics. You stand for a moment, letting the cool hold you, feeling how the building moderates temperature and volume in the same motion. You learn quickly that building a mosque of this scale is choreography, not spectacle. Baskets of mud pass shoulder to shoulder, ladders lean in familiar angles. Children run errands, and elders call instructions that sound more like song than command. The annual replastering turns maintenance into festival. Neighbors bring ladders and paddles. Families compete good-naturedly over who brings the best stew to sustain the workers, and laughter threads through labor. There is a proud economy here. Work equals identity, and the mosque becomes a social stage where the town's competence and care are displayed. You notice the small human gestures that mark the place as lived in. An elder points to a notch on a beam and says, "I climbed there first as a boy," and you imagine him tiny and brave. A woman shows you a small charm tucked into a niche for her child's blessing. Quirky tidbit. In several towns, masons tuck tokens. Beads, tiny carved shapes, a scrap of mirror, into layers of plaster as a private signature or charm. If you knew where to look, you could read a map of clandestine jokes and blessings hidden under the surface. It's both practical and playful, craftsmanship with a wink. This mosque works as civic center as much as sanctuary. Councils meet in its shade. Disputes are mediated in nearby courtyards. Market rules are sometimes hammered out under its eaves. A well-maintained facade signals care and order. A neglected one whispers decline. So repairing a fissure is not only a technical fix but a public statement. When elders climb ladders to apply new plaster, they are not simply mending clay. They are asserting the town's ongoing attention to itself. You watch one such team smooth a fresh coat and feel the quiet moral authority of steady hands at work. There is also a weather story always running in the background. Thick earthen walls stabilize interior temperatures, but heavy rains threaten edges and corners. When a storm hits, it can shear a ledge or soften a base. Prepared communities respond quickly with tarps, paddles, and buckets. You see masons smoothing mud like nurses tending a wound, coaxing the surface back to health. Maintenance is insurance and ritual. The annual replastering is both practical defense and public reaffirmation. We will not let the rains erase us. Of course, the mosque's history bears the imprint of external encounters. Colonial administrators sometimes introduced imported materials and different conservation ideas. Cement, fired brick, or impermeable coatings, promising longevity but sometimes triggering problems when those materials altered moisture flow. The lesson learned the hard way is that earthen buildings operate with the logic of breath and evaporation. Suffocate that, and unexpected damage follows. The architecture is conservative in the best sense. It preserves what works while folding in new solutions cautiously. You also catch the human vanity folded into craft. Some masons take quiet pride in the straightness of their Toron, another in the smooth curve of an arch. There are gentle competitions over whose plaster is the smoothest, whose carved door is the most intricate. Joke 1. There is apparently a local leaderboard for most photogenic buttress. Joke 2. A mason once insisted his Toron was so straight it could be used as a sundial, and for a week children timed their games by his boasting. These small vanities keep the craft lively. And then there are the playful, secretive things that make the mosque feel private and human. A young apprentice once hid a tiny carved animal in a recessed niche as a prank. For years, outsiders whispered about the mosque's guardian, while the craftsman chuckled. You think back to the mixing pit and those strange stories about crocodile dung and crushed pottery, experiments half practical, half superstitious, and smile. Historians still argue whether such additives were primarily technical improvements or symbolic acts meant to bind craft, clan, and spirit together. Did they add dung and shell because it improved performance? Or because embedding those materials carried meaning and comfort? The answer likely sits somewhere in the middle. As evening comes, the mosque's silhouette relaxes into dusk, the Tron like a comb of fingers against the sky. The call to prayer rises and you feel the building breathe with the people inside, a shared mediation of climate and community. You step away with a thumb smudged in plaster and the odd, satisfying knowledge that you have touched a thing that is remade again and again by hands that remember. Joke 3. If the mosque had a social feed, its followers would be the neighbors who show up with ladders every spring, and its top comment would be, "Don't forget the spare paddle." You walk back toward the drying bricks and the pit you know so well now, carrying the mosque's shape in your head. It is not a monument because it is finished. It is a monument because it is tended, complained about, improved, and loved. The timber ribs that once looked like scaffolding now read as fingers inviting touch, inviting return. You fold that into your day, into stomps in the clay, into careful turns of a drying brick, and you realize that endurance here lives as much in rhythm and ritual as in material. The mosque will need hands again next season. You feel a small, patient comfort that those hands will come. You step through a low doorway and the world rearranges itself. The scatter of single rooms coalesces into a courtyard, a small open heart where life collects and slows. Shade pools in the corners and the air tastes faintly of hearth smoke and warm clay. Light arrives in soft bands that make time feel kinder. The courtyard is not decoration, it's practical ceremony, a place where porridge is stirred, infants nap, jugs are balanced on heads, repairs are negotiated, and gossip becomes the town's slow newswire. You fold into its rhythm without consulting a map. A mainstream fact anchors this easy absorption. Across many Sahelian and Sudano-Sahelian settlements, houses were traditionally organized around central courtyards precisely because they moderate heat, channel breezes, and keep smoke from cooking fires away from sleeping areas. The courtyard is climate control, daycare, workshop, and social club bundled into one compact room. You run your fingers along a packed earth bench, and trace tool marks that read like a ledger of use. Years of hands smoothing the same wood and mud until it feels familiar under the skin. The sounds here are layered and small. The steady thud of a pestle, the soft hiss of a simmering pot, a reed mat unrolling with a faint squeak, a child's bright laughter like a stone dropped into a still pond. People call across the space in brief, efficient sentences. More firewood? Turn the dough, watch the baby. And those small commands become choreography. You find yourself breathing to the courtyard's tempo, slower now, keyed to a domestic metronome rather than a clock. Joke 1. You try to clap on cue and mistime a beat. The neighbor next to you grins and declares you officially rhythmically challenged, which in this place is a tolerable sin. Food dominates the courtyard's moral economy. The three-stone hearth, the simplest of ovens, reigns, and women tend it like gardeners tending plants. Flatbreads blister and singe at the edge, stews thicken into silky comfort, and the smell of toasted peanuts weaves under everything. Someone offers you a warm piece of bread, less because you're a guest and more because sharing is the unspoken ledger of belonging. Quirky tidbit. In some houses, cooks bake a pinch of pepper into a ceremonial loaf so guests will remember them by the taste. It is domestic branding before marketing existed. You laugh inwardly at the timelessness of foodie ego. Some things never change. Work and apprenticeship blur together. A young boy demonstrates how to twist palm fiber into rope. An older woman rebinds a reed basket with nimble fingers. A mason tests a patch of plaster to show his apprentice the correct grain. These micro lessons are the day school. You learn by watching the angle of a wrist, the pressure on a tool, the tiny correction an elder makes without much comment. Attempt 1 and you fail clumsily. Attempt 2 and you improve under the steady, corrective humor of a person who has taught 100 hands this exact move. Joke 2. You are given the honorary title First-Time Apprentice, which requires no paperwork and zero benefits. The social currency here is favor, repaid in kind. You plaster a neighbor's wall today and, come harvest, they will fetch water for you. You sweep a path and you earn a bowl of stew. These exchanges create a low-interest economy of care that binds the compound together. An elder presses a cup of spiced tea into your palms as thanks, and the warmth of it lands deeper than any polite handshake you have practiced in your own life. There is pride in being useful. Rituals of care are visible and honored. Historians still argue whether these practices were solidified first by environmental constraints, adapting to heat, wind, and dust, or whether they evolved primarily from social customs tied to kinship and ritual obligations. But on the ground, the debate plays out in patient repetition rather than academic paper. Gender roles exist but are flexible where necessity demands. Women often manage the hearth and textiles while men might haul beams or take goods to market. Yet you see exceptions that remind you the categories are porous. An older man deftly weaving a mat, a teenage girl retying a thatch edge without hesitation. Privacy is calibrated differently here. The courtyard offers shelter yet keeps life in view, so problems surface quickly and are solved collectively. A roof leak will be noticed by mid-morning. Neighbors will arrive with ladders before noon because damage shared is damage halved. Joke 3. You picture a modern homeowners association trying to enforce that level of neighbor accountability? Parking squabbles would be settled with spectacular grace. Children dominate space in a way your urban planning never will. They invent games with stones and string, race between drying bricks, and barter marbles with a fervor that would make a stockbroker smile. Their safety depends on distributed attention. Everyone watches casually and intervenes only when required. You learn names quickly: Ali, Fatu, Musa, and their faces settle into your memory like small pressed flowers. The courtyard's design is a childcare method made visible. Kids are free to roam within a protected bowl of walls and to learn by repeated exposure to craft and conversation. Material life delights your tactile senses. Pots stack in patient pyramids, reed bundles lean like bundled promises, and tools live within easy reach. The same paddle that smooths a domestic wall might be used at the mosque's Tehran. Craft practice migrates between sacred and domestic labor, reinforcing community techniques. Quirky tidbit 2. In some compounds, families tuck tiny charms, beads, carved seeds, or a sliver of pottery, into wall plaster as private signatures or blessings. If you look closely under a smooth coat, you might find a wink left by a neighbor. It feels like stumbling on a footnote written by someone who cares. Later, the courtyard can become ceremonial without becoming formal. Weddings take place with few chairs and many palms. Naming rituals revolve around a bowl of water and a whisper, and elders dispense advice that reads like building instructions disguised as wisdom. Where to stack firewood, how to feather a plaster edge, who will fetch water on market day. A marriage rearranges hands available for roof repair. A birth reshuffles water runs and food deliveries. Social choreography is efficient and humane because survival depends on it. There is also a festival logic to maintenance. The same hands that mix mud at the pit will, on certain days, climb ladders to replaster a communal wall, and the work becomes social performance. Songs, shared stews, and rapid exchange of tools. You remember the Great Mosque's annual replastering, the grander civic moment, and you see the same pattern in miniature within each compound. The line between ritual and routine dissolves, which is probably why life here feels both disciplined and warm. Joke 4, you imagine an app called Devotional Maintenance that sends calendar reminders. Today, replaster. Bring ladders and snacks. At dusk, the courtyard remakes itself for sleep. Mats are rearranged to catch the coolest air. Some families sleep beneath woven palms, others in the courtyard bowl under the stars. Lullabies thread through the space. Embers are banked with focused care. An aunt tucks a blanket over a sleeping child with the same unspoken authority she would use to choose a lintel for a doorway. You are offered a small packet of spiced tea, a departure blessing, and you tuck it into your pocket like a talisman. Joke 5. You vow to brew it later so your apartment can briefly pretend to be courtyard adjacent. Before you leave, an elder asks you to help feather a cracked patch of plaster. The instruction is precise. Thin, outward strokes blending new mud into old, and your palm finally learns the motion. The act is practical and moral. A repaired wall signals attention, reciprocity, and a willingness to maintain common life. You walk away with mud under your nails and a quieter step, carrying a scrap of reed as a touchstone. You go back past the drying bricks and the stubbled mixing pit, thinking about how the courtyard turns daily labor into belonging. The walls you helped form will hold more than roofs. They will store laughter, quarrels, meals, and lullabies. That is the courtyard's secret and its promise. Architecture lived, repaired, and loved by hands that remember. You fall into the step of the women before you as naturally as if you had learned it your whole life. One, two, three. A tiny percussion that matches the jar's slow pendulum. The clay pot on a woman's head is an instrument and a metronome. It sets the household's day. You match your breathing to her exhale and the jar's faint, hollow thud, and suddenly your own pulse slows to the village's tempo. It is not poetic ornament, it is practical magic. Water is the village's lifeblood, and the way it is carried writes the day's schedule on bodies and on time. These jars come in many moods, some squat and bulbous, others tall and solemn like quiet watchtowers, but they all demand a certain stance. You straighten your back, tuck your chin, and let your neck become the balancing post. A thin ring of cloth or woven straw, sometimes a neat folded pad, sometimes a braided coil, nestles between skull and ceramic, smoothing small imperfections and turning a harsh rim into a cradle. You notice how each carrier's pad is folded slightly differently, a private signature. Once you learn to read them, blue checkered pads and red striped coils mark families, quick identifiers on the road. Children practice with tiny gourd cups. Elders watch them with a fond tightness that both protects and edits mistakes. A mainstream historical fact settles in like dust on a shelf. Pottery in West Africa is ancient and deep-rooted. Archaeologists have unearthed ceramic assemblages that date back millennia. So these water jars are the heirs to an invisible lineage of hands and kiln smoke. Pottery shaped daily life long before industrial containers existed. Households organized themselves around the jars, and jars in turn encouraged settlement patterns because water storage made everyday life possible at different scales. The vessels are not incidental props. They are technologies that let villages endure seasons. The filling ritual at the river or well feels ceremonial when you watch it. Baskets and ropes, a practiced dip, a smooth lift. There is a choreography. Pots are lowered carefully into the water, scooped, turned, and eased back into slings. If the current teases, two people work together. One braces, the other fills. There's a small language of gestures, a tilt of the chin, a fingertip flick, that signals when a pot is full. You watch a woman slide a wet palm around a lip and give the vessel a tiny test tap. That sound, to the trained ear, distinguishes a good fill from a sloppy one. You learn to move like her, steady, patient, anticipatory. Beyond physiology, the water run is social theater. People exchange recipes, bargains, gossip. News travels with measured steps. You learn that the woman with the blue head pad knows the best way to thicken peanut stew, that the younger girl carries messages between two households, that an old man who helps on market day knows which miller will lend him a spare flour sack. Jokes circle like small birds. A neighbor teases that if you carry water for a month, you earn the right to command the radio. Another says the new jar will make you irresistible at market. Joke 1. Your city playlists do not include this kind of earworm. Practical physics is folded into craft. Unglazed clay is porous. A slightly permeable jar leaks a whisper of moisture, and as that moisture evaporates, it cools the interior. Primitive evaporative cooling, working beautifully without electricity. You sip from a shared calabash and taste the minor miracle. Water that is cooler than the air, crisp and small as a blessing. Potters know this. They tune porosity and wall thickness to craft a jar that cools enough to feel luxurious, but not so porous that it bleeds away too quickly. A clever potter might thicken a base or add a rough slip to change that balance. Quirky tidbit. Some potters sometimes insert small whistles or sculpted vents near a jar's lip. Tiny ceramic trills that sing when water sloshes or when air moves with the filling. They were, you're told, invented partly for amusement and partly because they make it harder for thirsty children to sneak a swim without announcing themselves. Imagine a village where every clandestine dip came with a chorus of ceramic chirps. Suddenly, stealth is its own loudness. You smile and think the whistles would make for great theme music. Joke 2. Imagine a morning radio show hosted by whistling jars. Repair is humble art. Cracks are patched with a fine slurry, rims are bound with fiber corsets, and shattered pots are sometimes crushed down to become temper in new vessels or aggregate in wall plaster. The circular economy astounds you. Pottery feeds plaster, feeds bricks, and then feeds pottery again in little cycles. You look at a scarred brown jar and see the biography of a household. A patched belly means the pot has earned its keep. A worn pot has dignity and stories. A glossy new jar signals a gift or a recent market success. Safety practice lives in small gestures. Open wells are shaded or ringed with stones, ropes are checked, and shared cover rituals prevent toddlers from wobbling too close. Some households prefer boiling water, some let it settle and decant, and others add bitter or tannin-rich leaves because the taste deters certain pests. These are not superstition but pragmatic responses to local conditions. When seasons shift and a once reliable pool goes turbid, the carriers change course like sailors adjusting to wind. You watch them adapt without drama. At a small communal well, you see maintenance and pride entwined. A wooden pulley, a repaired peg, a recently spliced rope. When the rope frays, neighbors gather not with forms but with hands. The repair becomes a lesson where the elder demonstrates a splice and a child learns to tie the loop. The public good here is not an abstract policy. It is social labor performed in public and repaid in small favors and steady presence. Historians still argue whether such visible maintenance rituals developed primarily from ecological necessity, keeping water access reliable, or from social strategies that cemented obligations and alliances. But from where you stand, the two are braided together. You start to read jars like faces. A shiny new one is ceremonial. A battered pot is the workhorse. A patched rim signals thrift and longevity. There are special jars reserved for guests or for newborns, and their presence in a compound announces a mood, care, celebration, or caution. When soap is scarce, people rinse differently. When rain is near, jars are moved to high ground. The vessel's life becomes a map of household fortune and attention. The route home teaches you little courtesies. Step aside for a woman with a heavy neck load, slow when a child chases a goat across the path, steady your stride when passing a ladder. The jars change carriage at thresholds. A room's edge demands a polite pivot, a lid placed gently as if setting down a small altar. You place your own calabash down with care, impressed by how the small ceremony transforms into gratitude. Someone will carry your empty back tomorrow if you need it. As dusk settles, lanterns are lit and the jars sit like quiet sentries around compounds. And yes, remember that crocodile dung rumor? It gets an encore here. Children tap whistles and produce high, delighted notes while elders call softly to supper. The water you helped carry will smooth into porridge, steam into tea, and later be cupped to mix mortar for a wall patch the next day. The loop astonishes. Water fetched by one hand becomes shelter built by another. You leave the route with pruned fingers and a new rhythm under your skin. A small shard of fired clay slipped into your pocket feels like a ridiculous talisman, but it links you to the potters and the mud brick masons and the women who carry life across sun and dust. Walking past the pit where bricks were mixed, past the mosque's Tehran you helped touch, you understand something small and stubborn. The jars teach you about weight, balance, economy, and the way everyday motions make a world. You will remember the thud of a jar on cloth and the hush that follows it. The household has taken a breath, and so have you. You thread between poles and canvas, the market opening above you like a slow tent of ochre and indigo, and the air turns into a gentle assault of scent. Toasted peanuts, powdered chili, dried fish, and something that smells like cardamom got lost on its way to a perfume shop. Stalls sit shoulder to shoulder, adobe walls behind them, and people move with the easy economy of someone who expects to meet the same faces tomorrow and next year. The market is where clay houses and courtyard life spill outward. It is where the pit and the bricks meet the road, where recipes travel faster than letters, and where a story can buy you credit for a sack of grain. You lean into the bustle and find your steps slowing, as if the market's pace were calibrated to the beat of the village itself. A mainstream historical fact anchors the scene. Trans-Saharan trade routes for centuries funneled salt, gold, cloth, and ideas across West Africa, and local markets were nodes in that vast network. Markets like those in Timbuktu and Gao are famous examples where goods and knowledge exchanged hands in slow, cyclical rhythms. You sense that legacy in the way merchants display spices in cone-shaped piles, in the careful folding of cloth, and in the way older traders quietly keep accounts in their heads. The market is a living archive of technique and taste, and the things for sale, salt, indigo, calabashes, carry histories as much as utility. Approach a spice stall and you realize color itself is being sold. Turmeric glows like dawn. Powdered peanuts sit in tawny hills. Smoky paprika leans toward the red of dusk. A woman with a cloth-wrapped headscarf smiles and scoops fragrant piles into a small sack, her hand moving in a practiced arc that you could imitate but would not master. She sprinkles a pinch into your palm for you to smell. It is almost instructional. This is how stew finds its backbone. This is how porridge gets comfort. You nod, inhaling tiny narratives of famine seasons and festive days braided into each handful. Joke 1. You pretend to evaluate like a sommelier and declare an aromatic nose that earns a delighted wink rather than any cashback. The cloth stalls are rivers of pattern and thread. Indigo cloth pools like dusk. Cotton folds like river mud. Bright prints jab the air with geometry. Merchants unroll swatches like playing cards, waiting for your gasp or for the silence that signals respect. Textiles are not merely fabric here. They are statements of identity. A strip of woven cotton might mark lineage, a marital status, or a week's luck. In the market, those social codes translate into price and priority. You run your fingers over a bolt and feel the weave hum. Looser weaves for everyday wear, tighter for ceremonial robes. Touch is itself a form of appraisal. Accounts are kept differently here. Memory and trust, not ledgers and apps. A trader will remember a family's tastes, a client's preference for coarser grain, the small debts owed and forgiven. Historians still argue whether written notations or oral credit systems predominated in certain periods. What is clear is that the market operates on reputations and repeated encounters. The trader who remembers your grandmother's name will extend credit. The one who does not might lose a customer forever. Credit is social and accumulates like layered plaster, visible if you know where to look. Watch a barter and you see an economy of stories. A woman offers a handful of dried fish and a secret about when the river runs richest. A tailor offers a length of cloth and a rumor about a caravan due in 2 days with new dyes. Information is currency. The bazaar is less about immediate cash conversion than about durable relationships. You find yourself swapping small confidences, a hometown, a joke, a tip about which baker gets the best flatbread at dawn. In return, someone points you to a slow-cooking stew that will fix your hunger for the price of a smile. Quirky tidbit. In some markets, sellers intentionally display one imperfect item as a test, the canary piece. If a customer points at the flawed cloth, the seller knows to lower the price and start a conversation. If no one notes it, the seller keeps it as a private joke. You grin at the idea. A medieval focus group dressed in indigo. Joke 2. Imagine influencer marketing with cloth cones and whispered endorsements. The ancient version probably had fewer hashtags and more herbal tea. The market's architecture is improvisational. Stalls assembled from wooden poles, dried grass, and patched canvas lean against the sturdier adobe. You notice how the permanent and temporary interlock. The canvas offers shade. The clay wall offers storage. The two make a system that is both flexible and resilient. When a storm threatens, traders lash down their awnings and move goods into sheltered alcoves carved into house facades. You see people move as if the market were a living thing they consult. They read wind and light the way you might read your phone's weather app, except the market's forecasts are embedded in experience and old bones rather than satellites. Sounds here form a softer orchestra. The rattle of beads, the slap of folded cloth, the murmur of bargaining, the low register of older men reciting prices like poetry. Children run errands with nimble ankles, carrying small balances and messages. An elderly vendor keeps time by tapping a wooden staff. It is his clock, and he is punctual. You notice how little of the market is hurried. People prefer patience and the long game. A hasty buyer is seldom trusted. Joke 3. You think of your city's one-click culture and imagine it stumbling awkwardly through these lanes with a credit card and a confused expression. The exchange culture is ritualized. Bargaining is not rude. It is conversational. A price lowered is a compliment accepted. There are scripts, a first offer, a polite refusal, a counteroffer that ends with laughter and a handshake-like nod. You learn to let silence be a tool. It forces the trader to cover the next beat with a concession or a story. The rhythm of haggling is like music, with rests and crescendos designed to leave both parties smiling. Sometimes a trade ends with fresh mint tea passed across a cloth. Sometimes it ends with a shared tip about the river's moods. The market is also where repairs happen. Cobblers sit on low stools, needles poised. A woman with a basket of mending pins patches cloth that will last seasons. A boy sharpens tools so a knife can cut cleanly. Skills circulate here. Someone fixes a pot, someone stitches a sandal, someone sharpens a blade. There is an economy of conservation. Goods are repaired and patched lovingly because new is not always better. You watch a craftsman stitch a sandal in patient, perfect loops, each stitch meant to last through rains and market miles. The market repairs bodies of goods the same way families repair roofs, carefully, publicly, and with neighborly pride. Small ceremonies thread through stalls. A healer ties a strip of fabric to a post to bless trade. A merchant pours a little oil into a bowl as thanks for a good day. Quirky tidbit 2. In some locales, merchants hang charms, cowrie shells, bright cloth, to ward off envious customers said to suck a stall's luck. It sounds theatrical, but you watch the charms flutter and wonder whether anyone has ever tried more persuasive marketing than a painted scrap of cloth and a neighbor's recommendation. Historians still argue whether some charms were pragmatic talismans or invented traditions that later gained economic value. As the sun leans, the market's light slants and traders begin to tally in their heads, closing soft ledgers before heading home. Children test sweet samples. Elders exchange the day's news. The cook with the best stew leans back and breathes. You buy a small packet of spice, less because you need it, and more because you want to carry the market's scent home. The seller wraps it in brown paper with practiced hands and passes it over with a note of kinship. You leave with the taste of smoke on your tongue and a new rhythm in your step. You depart with more than goods. You carry favors in your pocket and names folded into memory. You carry the sense that exchange here is not a single instant, but a conversation extended across time. Walking back under the canvas toward the Tehran of the mosque and the stubbled pit where the bricks dry, you notice how the market's looseness stitches back into the steadiness of the village. Spice clinging to clay, barter braided into reciprocity. You chuckle at the old joke about crocodile dung strengthening bricks. Whether myth or experiment, it's precisely the sort of story that gets folded into craft, repeated, and then treated as technique. Joke 4, you imagine a future textbook footnote reading. On the authority of an anonymous spice seller, crocodile dung was, allegedly, in vogue. You step toward the courtyard and feel the market's generous beat tag along in your footsteps. The same irregular, generous rhythm that tells you this village is built not only from mud and straw, but from many small, repeated conversations. You climb the short ladder because that's what people do here. The roofs are part of the house you live in, not a distant architectural afterthought. Your hand finds the beam's worn place without thinking. Centuries of palms have smoothed it to a comfortable groove. Up on the flat roof, the village opens like a clay quilt. Patches of fresh plaster, rows of drying bricks, Toron beams jutting like ribs, and smoke curling lazily from distant cooking fires. You move slowly because speed accomplishes nothing here, and the roof rewards the measured pace. Roofs in this landscape are living surfaces. They are timber lattices layered with packed earth, sometimes finished with reeds or palm mats, sometimes sealed with successive coats of smooth plaster. People sleep on them in the hottest nights, spread mats to dry grain, and set out trays of fish or peppers to sun-cure. A roof becomes a pantry, a parlor, a child's racetrack, and a quiet place to watch the sky. Joke 1. You toy with the idea of posting a rooftop sunset. Hashtag clay life seems niche, but oddly chic. And anyway, the Wi-Fi probably wouldn't make it past the courtyard wall. Repair is communal and ritualized. When a thin fissure shows after a heavy shower, ladders appear as if by choreography. Neighbors haul planks, elders bring paddles, and apprentices ferry buckets of fresh slurry. The work is loud and soft at once. Shouted instructions, the scrape of a trowel, the low hum of a repair song. There is pride in those hours. A patched roof is a visible ledger of care. You steady your footing against a Toron, the projecting beam you remember from the mosque, and someone teases, "Don't lean too hard, you'll become an architectural statement." Joke 2. The ribbed beams hold both hands and humor. You learn the grammar of repair by watching. Inspection is percussion. A mason taps across a packed surface, listening for hollow notes that betray voids. A finger traces a hairline crack to check for damp. A practiced knuckle tells whether plaster is adhering. Repairs are about layering, coarse mixes for volume, finer paste to seal the surface, applied at just the right dampness so a coat binds without shrinking into fissures. Timing matters. Smooth a coat in the blast of the midday sun, and it dries brittle. Leave it to breathe in late afternoon and it will settle like a comfortable blanket. The roof remembers how you treat it. A mainstream historical fact tucks into these routines. Across the Sahel and neighboring zones, flat-packed earth roofs have been a vernacular solution for centuries because they use local materials, minimize the need for imported hardware, and double as domestic space, sleeping, drying, and storing. So the roof's multifunctionality has been part of settlement longevity from ancient times to the present. It is practical, unglamorous, and profoundly adaptive. Practical improvisation blooms in surprising places. On some roofs you find shallow troughs for sprouting legumes or tiny boxes for mint and onions. Micro gardens that add flavor to soups and save a market trip. Old canoe ribs and salvaged posts become raised beds, light enough not to doom the beams. Rooftop gardening is both rebellion and economy. Coaxing edible green out of a hot, thin soil is an act of small optimism. You reach for a sprig of mint at midnight, and the cool crush on your tongue feels like victory. Quirky tidbit. Older masons sometimes keep a bag of crushed shell or potsherd near the plaster. They claim the sharp inclusions give the surface a little bite, so rain clings and wears the roof in a way that discourages sliding erosion. The shell provides a tiny rasp, and, so the story goes, the roof sings when wind passes over it. People laugh at the phrase, but they also keep the bag handy because practicality and superstition often walk the same path here. If something seems to help, the reason becomes less important than the result. The choreography of labor is human and efficient. Young men balance planks into temporary walkways. Women fold reed mats and set them aside. The master mason directs hands with economical gestures. You hold a paddle, smooth a corner, learn the cadence of a good stroke. Apprenticeship happens out loud. Errors corrected kindly, techniques passed fingertip to fingertip. Jokes cushion critique and keep humility in place. A newcomer laughs at a crooked edge and is told, gently, to leave the swagger for the market stall. Safety evolves into skill. Children crawl across roofs under watchful eyes before they walk away from the edge. Ropes and slings are improvised where modern harnesses are absent. A worker's footfall is measured, a crossing slow and intentional. You notice how people move as if the building were a partner. You put a hand where the roof expects one, and your step becomes part of a practiced conversation between flesh and clay. Weather planning is household discipline. Before rains, roofs are thickly replastered, parapets are heightened, channels at edges are cleared so runoff doesn't undermine vulnerable joints. People store extra reed mats and bundles of palm to cover emergency leaks. When a storm surprises the plane, ladders tilt and neighbors form a line. Tarps up, fresh mud thrown, quick hands pressing wet paste into softened spots. Repair is prophylactic as well as reactive. Maintenance is insurance against the season. Material economy is visible in small ways. Failed patches are crushed and returned to the mix. Crumbly scrap becomes temper in fresh coats. Timber is salvaged. Old door frames, canoe ribs, the remains of earlier roofs, so nothing is discarded lightly. An elder smiles and says, Even our mistakes feed the next wall, and you understand literal recycling as village policy. That economy undergirds resilience. There are also ceremonial edges. After a long day of patching, neighbors sometimes climb to smooth and then press a tiny smear of incense or gloss of oil into a fresh band of plaster, a gesture half maintenance, half blessing. Historians still argue whether such rites are survivals of older agrarian practices folded into domestic life or later accretions that secularize what was once formal ritual. Either way, the act binds repair to memory and prayer. The plaster carries intent as well as protection. At night, the roof becomes a quiet theater. You lie on a mat and listen to the village breathe. A dog barks, a distant call threads the air, a kettle whispers. The packed clay cools slowly, storing the day's heat and releasing it at a gentle pace. So the roof is not merely shelter but a slow thermostat. You look up and feel yourself shrink into the soft regulation of the place. Humor threads through the dark. Someone jokes the roof deserves a raise. You whisper that maybe it needs a holiday, and you both laugh just enough to soften the day's aches. When you finally descend the ladder, your hands dusted with plaster and your shoulders pleasantly tired, the loop of village life feels complete. You pass the pit where you stomped mud, the drying bricks stacked like promises, the market where people bartered in spice and story, the roofs, the Tehran, the mosque. They are all chapters of the same domestic book, bound by repeated repair. You pocket a small reed scrap as a talisman, a private souvenir of a day spent learning to mend surfaces that hold lives. You notice, too, that roofs keep silent records. A neat strip of newer plaster might mark the year someone returned from a long journey. A darker patch remembers a sudden storm. If you learn to read these surfaces, you can map favors, marriages, and floods. The roof is a household's annotated history. You step back into the courtyard with the ladder left for dawn, and the memory of the roof's patient wait stitched into your gait. Joke 3, you whisper that if roofs had resumes, yours would list reliable under pressure as a top skill. You run your thumb along a shallow groove and it leaves a thin, dusty trail. It feels like reading a secret Morse code written in clay. The wall answers with a faint powder under your skin. This is not merely earth. It is a worked surface that has been smoothed, notched, and sometimes painted. A face that records seasons and small dramas. Color here arrives in modest accents rather than grand gestures. A white band edging a doorway, a rust-red stripe around a window, a tiny dab of blue at a lintel. Those small touches announce a household's tastes and histories with a quiet confidence you have come to respect. Pigments are born of place and purpose. Iron oxides give warm reds and ochres. Chalk and kaolin produce cooling whites. Crushed seeds and leaves yield pale yellows and greens. You learn a mainstream historical fact almost by osmosis. For centuries, West African builders and potters used mineral and plant pigments for buildings and body decoration, a practice visible in archaeological layers and in the notebooks of early travelers. The palette is a map of geology and trade. Where iron-rich soils sit near the surface, walls blush. Where limestone shows, facades shine soft and pale. Meaning accumulates quickly in color. A whitewash threshold often signals purification or hospitality. A painted stripe may mark lineage, a marriage alliance, or a household that recently hosted a naming. Tiny painted eyes near doorways are not mere whimsy. They are watchers, protective and practical. You notice how motifs cluster where life concentrates, by jars of water at cooking corners, under eaves where children nap, and it feels as if the house annotates the habits of its inhabitants. The village becomes a ledger of domestic life, a running record written in bands and spirals. There are curious stories that travel with pigment. A mason upriver once powdered broken blue glass beads into plaster to test a vivid tint. For a season, that wall seemed to glow, and neighbors spoke of it like a miracle, though the color softened after 2 rains. The mason laughed and said beads are for necklaces, not lintels. Historians still argue whether occasional brilliant blues and greens in older coatings reflect rare imports through long-distance trade networks or the ingenuity of local experiments with plant dyes and mineral blends. Either possibility delights you. Either way, a flash of unexpected color becomes a social bookmark. Carved relief and impressed patterns make walls readable by touch. Fingernail grooves, concentric rosettes, diamonds, and rows of impressed dots break up sunlit planes and provide practical benefits. A fluted band softens glare and offers apprentices handholds when they climb to replaster. Recessed niches shade jars from the noon heat. The masons design with the next maintenance in mind. The torque of a projecting rib, the spacing of a groove. Each decision eases the labor of the future. Remember the Tehran beams at the mosque? Those projecting timbers function as ladders in the architecture itself, and the same anticipatory thinking shows up in the smallest decorative details. Small signatures hide in plain sight. A spiral tucked into a corner, a carved fish at a lintel, a deliberately off-kilter dot. These are maker's marks or clan emblems. An elder points out a subtle antelope relief and tells you that a particular mason always tucked that little animal into his lintels. Families sought his hand because his work was believed to bring luck in the fields and rivers. Folklore and craft braid together until they are indistinguishable. A technical flourish accrues meaning and then becomes a talisman. The wall in that sense accumulates biography. Patterns also record contact and circulation. Indigo halos often mark where bolts of cloth once leaned against plaster. A certain granular red may hint at pigment traded from afar. Lime washes with an odd sheen can indicate a source of lime that was bargained for downriver. These subtle traces are tiny archaeological breadcrumbs. You find yourself tracing a smear from doorstep to market stall to riverside landing and imagining the itineraries that carried color along with goods and gossip. Doors are compact theaters of identity. A painted panel announces a household before you even step inside. Dots for lineage, stripes for marriage clan, fish for river livelihoods. Some houses reserve a particular hue for guests or newborns. A fresh white band is a celebratory banner without words. Visitors learn social information from paint before any conversation begins. The door functions as a public notice board disguised as decoration. Secret inscriptions appear in recessed niches. A mason's initials, a date scratched in a corner, a bead pressed into wet plaster as a charm. Syncretic touches are common. Geometric bands beside a thin painted cross, charms of different origin tucked under a sill, and they speak to a daily pluralism that is pragmatic and gentle. Historians still argue whether such syncretism was driven by external cultural shifts or emerged organically as households blended customs. On the ground, the result is usually cooperative rather than contested. There is an economy to color. Leftover textile dyes are often stirred into plaster. Crushed shells, charcoal, and potsherds become temper, changing texture and abrasion resistance. A broken pot gets pulverized and reincorporated. Resourcefulness is not an aesthetic choice but a necessity. You laugh when an elder recounts a mason who ground a cherished necklace to make a pigment. Some called him devoted, others called him wasteful. Joke 1. You imagine a modern influencer pulverizing luxury sneakers to make a statement color, and wonder whether the internet would appreciate that level of dedication. Decoration and utility entwine. Ridges and grooves that please the eye also shed water more effectively. Recessed shelves keep pottery safe from the sun. A darker band behind a shelf hides generations of soot. Many decorative choices began as clever technical fixes and hardened into customs. You start to think of beauty here as something earned by practical necessity. Recoloring is ritual and maintenance at once. Before harvest, during weddings, or around a mosque's communal replastering, compounds freshen coats and retouch motifs. Ladders appear, songs thread the air, children carry palm fronds like banners, and neighbors pass paddles and bowls of stew between strokes. Painting becomes a communal reaffirmation of care. A fresh coat is both repair and announcement. You join a lintel party, cupping cool water, handing a paddle, tasting stewed peanuts between brushstrokes, and you feel the small joy of contributing to collective upkeep. Curious additives keep craft lively. Elders recommend a dash of ash or millet root to change drying time. Others smear a little oil for sheen. The crocodile dung rumor circulates with conspiratorial chuckles. Some insist odd additives ward off pests or alter binding. Historians still argue whether such folk additives had consistent technical benefits or mainly symbolic value, but experiment and thrift often overlap, and useful innovations can emerge from both curiosity and necessity. Children leave marks that become beloved. A careless thumbprint pressed into fresh plaster turns into a future anecdote. An apprentice's spiral, conceived as a joke, is later read as a maker's flourish. Joke 2. You picture a boutique selling artisan thumbprints with ridiculous provenance tags and feel a private giggle at the thought. As evening falls, pigments soften. Whites warm to cream, reds deepen into warm mulberry. Tiny embedded beads and shells wink under lamplight like distant stars. From a distance, the village reads like a manuscript annotated in color. Margins, headings, and footnotes of repair and celebration. Walking past a lintel you helped paint, you feel a small domestic pride that has nothing to do with likes or followers. You watch a pigment being prepared before you leave. A mason grinds ochre on a flat stone until it feels like fine flour. A woman strains plant dye through cloth. Another tests a smear on scrap plaster to watch how it breathes. Binders are simple. Water, sometimes a touch of tree gum or oil, and the test patch tells whether a tint will settle and endure. Children cheer when a sample dries evenly, delighted that the wall has adopted their tiny contribution. Modern pressures nudge the palate. Cement paints and synthetic coatings promise permanence but can suffocate a wall's breath. And older hands warn that impermeable finishes sometimes trap moisture and lead to hidden decay. Tourists point cameras at favored doorways and can make a motif fashionable overnight. Preservation debates are urgent and nuanced. New materials can offer short-term gains but risk altering the long-term ecology of earthen architecture. Joke 3. You imagine a conservator arriving with a laser scanner and being handed a paddle only to be told, "First, learn how to smooth a seam." The image makes you grin. You notice how motifs also mediate social life. A repaired band might mark an agreement over a boundary. A retouched stripe can record that a family returned from travel. In that sense, the walls are legal documents no court clerk would understand. Craftspeople remember storms, bargains, reconciliations, and these memories are written into paint and form. Young artists remix the old grammar into contemporary flourishes, stylized repeats, graffiti-like marks, playful color combinations. Some elders frown while others smile. The village is conversational rather than static. Historians still argue about the pace and direction of change. Do new materials dilute tradition or extend it? Your answer, after a day of smudges and laughter, is that both are true. Life is layered like plaster, and each layer contains the others. You step away with a smudge on your thumb and a secret urge to press a tiny spiral into a wet patch somewhere, a civilized vandalism that feels perfectly at home here. The walls are not mute, they speak in stripes and spirals, in white bands and small blue dabs, and you have learned a little of their language. You leave feeling richer for it. You lean against a wall that seems to hum with stories, not because the clay vibrates, but because the surface holds a density of human intent, so thick you could read a life in the grooves. In the hush of late afternoon, elders settle on low stools and begin to speak the past into the air, and you find yourself drawn to their voices like someone who has misplaced a familiar song. Legends here are not footnotes to architecture, they are the scaffolding. A farmhouse, a mosque, or low round granary accumulates meaning as much by stories told around it as by the mortar that binds its bricks. A mainstream historical fact presses gently into the narrative. Oral traditions in West African societies have long served not only as repositories of genealogy and law, but also as practical manuals, telling when to plant, when to repair, and which mix of earth best resists seasonal flood. Buildings, in that sense, are physicalized memory. A house becomes an archive you can touch, not just a roof you inhabit. You listen as a woman recites a story about a long ago rain and the family who learned to build raised thresholds to stop water creeping into children's beds. The story is a repair manual recited as song, and you feel the logic settle under your skin. Stories here often fold sacred and mundane together in ways that surprise outsiders. One elder tells of a founding ancestor who is said to have walked along the riverbank and scooped up soil with a spoon that sang. The spoon's song taught the ancestor how to mix the mud so walls could breathe. Another village swears that a particular lintel contains the imprint of a saint's foot. Some see it as myth, others read it as a maker's mark, but everyone treats the lintel with extra care when passing beneath. Myth helps memory travel. A story about a saint's footprint is a mnemonic for a technical decision. Build the lintel higher, and your doorway resists runoff. Mythic thinking provides moral maps for action. A favorite tale tells of a neighbor who refused to help during a communal replastering, and later found his roof leaking in an inconvenient way. The moral, help your neighbors because walls remember, functions like an oral covenant. From your seat, you watch hands smooth new mud and hear the story shape behavior. The legend encourages cooperation in plain, memorable terms. Historians still argue whether these narratives originated as conscious social engineering, or whether they accreted from individual anecdotes that later hardened into custom, but on the ground the effect is practical. Stories make labor fungible and obligations visible. Ghost tales are common and tend to have architectural detail. A child whispers about the night builder, a shadow who walks with a paddle and straightens warped tiles when the moon is new. At first, you smile at the dramatics, but then you notice the practical advice embedded in such a specter. Check your roof after big temperature swings because tiny fissures widen overnight. The myth teaches vigilance dressed in spookery. Joke 1. You imagine a vacancy, a wanted night builder must enjoy paddle work and operate silently. Competitive biscuits. Rituals amplify materials into meaning. When a family plants a carved stick into a freshly laid corner, it is not merely symbolic. The act marks ownership, signals the household calendar, and sometimes hides a small charm, a bead or coin, to bring luck. In some compounds, masons press ancestral tokens into mortar to bind family history to structure. A charm in a niche, a child's thumbprint in a lintel, a hidden pebble tucked into the foundation. Quirky tidbit. An old mason swears that a shell pressed at a wall's base discourages certain pests because they don't like the salt. And while you raise an eyebrow, you also note that many practical customs began as experiment and stayed because they worked. Marriage and lineage find their places in walls too. A newlywed couple may carry a bat of fresh plaster to the compound and smear it where elders instruct. An act equal parts promise and practical labor. In some villages, the first plaster mix of a household is blessed by an elder who intones both ancestor names and mixing ratios. The blessing is not only spiritual but didactic. Here's how thick to make the corner. Here is how much straw to fold in. When you press a palm into the wet mix during such a rite, you feel ceremonial weight and civic duty in one measured motion. Tales of trickster masons pass around the same table as technical talk. One story tells of a clever mason who painted a fake crack to shame a lazy apprentice into learning how to repair a real one. Another recounts a woman who pretended a wall was haunted to persuade a son to stay and help, rather than migrate. These fables work like social therapy. They negotiate obligations with humor and teach lessons where a lecture might fail. The oral repertoire becomes a negotiation toolkit for architects of domestic life. The supernatural, predictably, is practical. In several compounds, a night lamp is left burning at an entrance because elders say the light keeps restive spirits from rearranging roof tiles. In others, a bowl of millet is left out for invisible helpers who, according to local imagination, might be propitious. You watch someone sprinkle ash on a threshold and then sweep it away. The ash may deter pests in a modest chemical way, even as it plays the role of talisman. Science and superstition braided into one economy of care. Legends are good for tourism too. Tourists pay for stories the way they pay for postcards. A guide will tell a convex wall tale about a saint's footprint and then lead visitors to the sliver of shade where the story supposedly originated. People nod and take pictures. Tourists translate local charm into revenue, and the village sometimes adapts the tale to be more picturesque. You see both harmless adaptation and tense negotiation. The legend has currency and someone will decide who keeps the rights to tell it. You remember the crocodile dung rumor and grin, glancing toward the pit and the mosque's Toron, as if the stories travel on the same wind that dries the bricks. Joke 2. You picture a souvenir rack with tiny blessed pebble trinkets. Utterly tasteful. Joke 3. An elder mimes the night builder demanding dates as payment, and you laugh aloud. Myths also encode building knowledge. A repeated theme is reciprocity between house and maker. A wall cared for will shelter the family. An uncared for wall will expose them to misfortune. That ethic is practical. Regular maintenance does prolong structural life. You watch as the myth circulates through children and elders alike, teaching repair like moral arithmetic. Repay service, receive shelter. The story forms a distributed maintenance policy wherein gossip and sermons both function as preventive conservation. Some stories are boastful historical claims dressed as legend. An old man insists a particular wall saved his village from a raid because it had been built with a song mixed into the mud, a phrase that sounds like an old recipe to you. Other elders smile and credit sensible defensive design, narrow openings for observation, raised parapets for watch, and stout, well-compacted foundations. Practical defense folded into cosmology. People credit spirit or skill depending on temperament. You notice how stories shape conservation choices. A house associated with a respected ancestor is replastered first. A lintel linked to a saint is repaired with finer material. Heritage becomes triaged by sentiment. When donors arrive with cement and paint, the village debates whether an outsider's improvement will help or harm the house's capacity to breathe. The debate is fierce because myth and masonry collide. You feel the weight of those decisions. Choosing a synthetic coating might preserve appearance but change drying dynamics, and a once unknown improvement can cause hidden decay. Historians still argue whether past communities adopted new materials opportunistically or clung to earthen methods until necessity forced change. Before you leave, you hear one more small story. A child's confession about hiding a pebble in a brick to see if walls noticed. The child's pride when the pebble becomes family joke and heirloom is palpable. It's ridiculous and adorable and perfectly instructive. The wall takes up household lore and holds it in place. You press your hand to a warm plaster patch and feel anchored by 1,000 small acts of memory. The stories sit under the surface, patient as the mud, waiting for someone to tap the wall and ask a question. You notice the first foreign building, not because it rises higher, but because it refuses to breathe. Its surfaces are smooth, painted in a confident off-white that the sun reflects like a small, stubborn glare. Someone proud and punctual must have ordered that paint by catalog. Someone who never replasters in the rain. Outsiders come in boots and blueprints with pamphlets that laud impervious coatings and a vocabulary that calls for maintenance-free facades. They arrive with good intentions, boxes of cement, and a belief that solidity is synonymous with improvement. A mainstream historical fact distills here. During the colonial and early post-colonial eras, European engineers and administrators often promoted materials like cement, fired brick, and corrugated metal as substitutes for local earthen techniques, because these materials matched industrial supply chains and the colonizers' own building practices. The promotional logic promised lower upkeep and modern hygiene, but reality proved messier. New materials sometimes solved one problem and created another. Impermeable finishes that trapped moisture, metal roofs that changed interior acoustics, and building schedules that did not account for communal labor cycles. The first cement roof you encounter promises permanence. It does not promise the neighbor's ladder, the communal song, or the ritual of annual replastering that bound people together. You watch how the White House becomes both prized and isolated. It draws admiration from a distance, but when a crack appears, the owner calls a paid mason from town rather than a neighbor who would bring a stew and a ladder. The social economies shift. Joke 1. Someone half jokes that cement houses come with a warranty you can't read. Terms and conditions include a subscription to Lonely Repairs. There are tender contradictions, too. Schools in fired brick blocks keep chalk dust out of young hair. Clinics with metal roofs do offer more hours of service during downpours. A well-built kiln-fired building can resist pests that plague wattle and daub granaries. For many families, these are real gains and not merely status markers. Yet when an impermeable coat is applied to an earthen wall, you learn to look for hidden consequences. Damp, trapped in a way that rots interior timbers and alters drying cycles. The modern fix sometimes requires resources and rhythms the village does not have. Joke 2. You imagine a pamphlet in 3 languages that reads, "Modernity requires monthly maintenance, subscriptions sold separately." Historians still argue whether the diffusion of European materials was mostly coercive or co-optive. That is, whether communities adopted cement because they were forced by colonial planning and new institutions, or because they chose it for particular advantages and aspirations. The more you listen, the more you think the answer is both. Aspirations for change mingle with mandates, and human agency threads through layers of structural pressure. A cooperative leader tells you about young migrants sending remittances to buy sacks of cement. An elder counters with the story of a family that preferred a plastered, earthen facade because it kept the interior cool and the doorways familiar. You see creative hybridity everywhere. Where roads and vendors bring sacks of cement within reach, masons use a thin concrete ring beam at the foundation to anchor earthen walls. A pragmatic compromise that stabilizes without smothering breath. In another compound, a woman paints a low parapet with a protective lime wash and leaves the upper wall earthen and patterned. She says the treatment keeps splash damage off the base yet preserves the feel of home. These ad hoc solutions are clever adaptations, not capitulations. They read like compromise stitched into plaster. Outside aid workers complicate the conversation. They mean, well, nobody wants a collapsed clinic or a school with a leaky roof. Still, aid sometimes brings one-size-fits-all fixes that ignore local logics. A program might distribute zinc sheets for roofs where timber is scarce, and those sheets will make rainy nights louder and internal humidity harder to predict. Sometimes outsiders suggest sealing a revered mosque with a coating that will change its thermal behavior, and elders push back, not from superstition but from experience. As one village elder tells you, seal the wall and you hide the coughs inside. You notice the first foreign building not because it rises higher, but because it refuses to breathe. Its surfaces are smooth, painted in a confident off-white that the sun reflects like a small, stubborn glare. Someone proud and punctual must have ordered that paint by catalog. Someone who never replasters in the rain. Outsiders come in boots and blueprints with pamphlets that laud impervious coatings and a vocabulary that calls for maintenance-free facades. They arrive with good intentions, boxes of cement, and a belief that solidity is synonymous with improvement. A mainstream historical fact distills here. During the colonial and early post-colonial eras, European engineers and administrators often promoted materials like cement, fired brick, and corrugated metal as substitutes for local earthen techniques, because these materials matched industrial supply chains and the colonizers' own building practices. The promotional logic promised lower upkeep and modern hygiene, but reality proved messier. New materials sometimes solved one problem and created another. Impermeable finishes that trapped moisture, metal roofs that changed interior acoustics, and building schedules that did not account for communal labor cycles. The first cement roof you encounter promises permanence. It does not promise the neighbor's ladder, the communal song, or the ritual of annual replastering that bound people together. You watch how the White House becomes both prized and isolated. It draws admiration from a distance, but when a crack appears, the owner calls a paid mason from town rather than a neighbor who would bring a stew and a ladder. The social economies shift. Joke 1. Someone half jokes that cement houses come with a warranty you can't read. Terms and conditions include a subscription to Lonely Repairs. There are tender contradictions, too. Schools in fired brick blocks keep chalk dust out of young hair. Clinics with metal roofs do offer more hours of service during downpours. A well-built kiln-fired building can resist pests that plague wattle and daub granaries. For many families, these are real gains and not merely status markers. Yet when an impermeable coat is applied to an earthen wall, you learn to look for hidden consequences. Damp, trapped in a way that rots interior timbers and alters drying cycles. The modern fix sometimes requires resources and rhythms the village does not have. Joke 2. You imagine a pamphlet in 3 languages that reads, "Modernity requires monthly maintenance." Subscriptions sold separately. Historians still argue whether the diffusion of European materials was mostly coercive or co-optive. That is, whether communities adopted cement because they were forced by colonial planning and new institutions, or because they chose it for particular advantages and aspirations. The more you listen, the more you think the answer is both. Aspirations for change mingle with mandates, and human agency threads through layers of structural pressure. A cooperative leader tells you about young migrants sending remittances to buy sacks of cement. An elder counters with the story of a family that preferred a plastered, earthen facade because it kept the interior cool and the doorways familiar. You see creative hybridity everywhere. Where roads and vendors bring sacks of cement within reach, masons use a thin concrete ring beam at the foundation to anchor earthen walls. A pragmatic compromise that stabilizes without smothering breath. In another compound, a woman paints a low parapet with a protective lime wash and leaves the upper wall earthen and patterned. She says the treatment keeps splash damage off the base, yet preserves the feel of home. These ad hoc solutions are clever adaptations, not capitulations. They read like compromise stitched into plaster. Outside aid workers complicate the conversation. They mean well, nobody wants a collapsed clinic or a school with a leaky roof. Still, aid sometimes brings one-size-fits-all fixes that ignore local logics. A program might distribute zinc sheets for roofs where timber is scarce, and those sheets will make rainy nights louder and internal humidity harder to predict. Sometimes outsiders suggest sealing a revered mosque with a coating that will change its thermal behavior, and elders push back, not from superstition but from experience. As one village elder tells you, seal the wall and you hide the coughs inside. You even imagine a flustered civil servant, clipboard abandoned, trying to smooth a seam with a borrowed paddle. Comical, but the image keeps you smiling. In truth, the most durable solutions you've seen begin at tea with dust on the table. A mason, an elder, and an engineer planning together, testing a thin ring beam here, a lime wash there. Joke 3. If there were an awards ceremony, the best collaboration would win a ladder-shaped trophy and a lifetime supply of paddles. You pocket that ridiculous image and leave with a quieter respect for compromise. The sort that keeps people close, walls breathing, and ladders within reach of friendly hands. You notice them before the notebooks. The careful way a visiting scholar carries a tape measure, the soft rustle as a page turns, the quiet calibration of eyes that have read too many maps. They move through the village in slow reconnaissance. Photographers with measured frames, anthropologists scribbling gestures, conservation architects sketching wall profiles with drafting pencils that look scandalously civilized here. You are curious, they are curious, and the village watches both the work and the watchers with its usual blend of patience and humor. The scholars come to see what you have been living in, the patched parapets, the Tehran beams, the drying pit that smelled of straw and salt, and the mosque that refuses to be simply seen as relic. They have come to write notes and sometimes to be convinced. A mainstream historical fact is obvious in their kit. Earthen architecture has been the subject of systematic study for decades, and field workers have long documented construction techniques, maintenance cycles, and social rituals tied to building. Treatises, surveys, and ethnographies published by careful hands are why you can stand here and know that many practices have deep roots. The scholar's presence is partly archival. They want measurements, recipes, and sequences to preserve knowledge that might otherwise be flattened by time or replaced by imported concrete. You watch an architect sketch the mosque's buttresses and then measure the angle of a Tehran, his pencil marking the same ribs your hand knows by feel. The encounter is not neutral. Researchers carry assumptions as much as notebooks. Some approach with respectful humility, listening more than instructing. Others arrive armed with charts, grant deadlines, and a conviction that a better material will fix local problems. You watch a polite debate begin between a conservationist who prefers breathable earthen coatings and a development technician who praises cement's quick fix. The phrase rings out in one of their quiet meetings. Historians still argue whether industrial materials represent progress or displacement in vernacular contexts. It is not just jargon, it shapes choices. What gets documented, what gets recommended, what gets funded. You stand near a table where students lay out samples. Old plaster scraped from a mosque, a bag of straw from last season, a ribbon of reed. They compare fiber lengths and mineral grains under a loupe like jewelers. A graduate student laughs and confesses she once tried to replicate a village mix in a university lab and was stunned that the hand-pressed bricks performed differently in the climate-controlled room. "We had to go back to the field," she says, an embarrassed smile in place. Joke 1. Academic labs, it turns out, do not simulate midday dust very well. Quirky tidbits surface easily in this space. One visiting researcher keeps a small notebook of maker's marks, curlicues, thumbprints, and tiny spirals left by masons, that they photograph and catalog. Another quietly admits to trading pages of her field diary for a mason's paddle and a lesson in tamping technique. You like the image? An exchange table where notebooks and paddles swap value. Scholars are not all aloof. A few have been known to roll up their sleeves, get mud under their nails, and then, with the gravity of repentant converts, ask the mason to teach them how to smooth a seamed corner. You hand them a paddle and watch their face change. The procedure is humbling and comic. Joke 2. If tenure committees had to tamp bricks, promotion reviews would be a lot more tactile. The recordings are unevenly received. Some villagers welcome documentation. They see a chance to archive knowledge or to attract funds for communal replastering. Others watch with skepticism. Research can turn living practice into a closed case study. a museum label that freezes motion into a past tense sentence. You see both responses. An elder who leads a replastering festival offers the student a warm bowl of millet and a story about a repair that saved a harvest. She then asks the student politely whether the upcoming project will respect the work schedule of elders who must travel to markets. The scholar promises to include labor calendars in her report. The elder nods and smiles, knowing promises are measured by return visits more than by paper. Fieldwork has its practicalities and its absurdities. A structural engineer will test a wall's compressive strength by drilling tiny cores and sending them to a lab 3 borders away. Meanwhile, the mason will demonstrate a quick local test, tap 4 planks together and listen for tone. And it works, provided you have the ear. You watch the engineer furrow his brow at the planks and then grin when the sound matches the lab report. The lab is precise, the ear is pragmatic. Historians still argue whether laboratory testing or sustained observational practice better captures vernacular performance. Both have value. Both have limits. Ethics threads every question. Who owns the collected data? If a scholar films an apprentice smoothing plaster, should the clip be free for the community or archived behind a university paywall? You feel the tension. A researcher mentions participatory archiving, returning copies of recordings to families and training locals to document repair rituals themselves. It feels like a good model, though it demands time and resources that are not always in grant budgets. You meet a camera operator who says with wry candor that she started her own small workshop after watching masons work. She now makes simple wooden molds for local builders and sells them locally. That small life change feels like an ethical win. There are scale questions too. A handful of case studies becomes policy if a donor or NGO picks it up. An NGO with a neat infographic about sustainable housing might advise a regional office to subsidize certain materials. Good intentions can spiral. A plaster recipe that works for a small compound becomes a recommended standard across a humid valley where it fails spectacularly. Scholars know this, and that knowledge carries a cautionary tone. Document widely, test locally, and avoid prescription without adaptation. This is not theoretical hair splitting. The consequences are real roofs and dry children at stake. Joke 3. You picture a blue ribbon panel of scholars convened not to debate theory, but to test which paddle makes the best noise. Sometimes research uncovers surprising continuities. A conservation scientist shows you a grain analysis linking a mortar recipe used in a 15th century wall to the mixture still used at the mosque's annual replastering. The continuity humbles you. Techniques persist because they work, because they became woven into social cycles. At other times, research reveals abrupt breaks. Villages that adopted metal roofs or cement foundations quickly, and then discovered unintended moisture problems. The dual evidence, persistence and rupture, makes a scholar's notebook a necessary but not sufficient guide. You also watch scholarship translate into advocacy in interesting ways. A careful ethnography of communal maintenance practices can be a template for development programs that support rather than supplant local labor. You meet a planner who used ethnographic calendars to schedule public workdays at times. Elders were available, increasing participation dramatically. Small adjustments can matter. Historians still argue whether top-down heritage designations help or harm living communities. In your view, the answer rests on whether those designations return agency and resources to locals or extract their labor for spectacle. Tourism and scholarship sometimes collaborate. A well-researched guidebook highlights repair festivals and channels visitor fees into a maintenance fund. This is a tidy loop when managed well. Documentation funds repair, and repair funds living practice. But the loop can tangle. If funding favors aesthetics over structure, repairs become cosmetic and vulnerability deepens. You see an example where a grant sponsored a whitewash that looked lovely but later required more frequent patching because it altered evaporation. The lesson feels immediate. Interventions must respect the wall's breadth. Quirky experiments by scholars are charmingly human. A visiting student once tried to bake a small test brick in a makeshift kiln and ended up with a hardened lump that children used as a toy boat. Another time, a researcher painted her notes on a scrap of plaster and left it as a gift. These little stunts humanize data collection and sometimes make locals laugh, which is often the best opening for trust. Joke 4. You imagine a conference where academics present best field bloopers as icebreakers. As night settles, the researchers pack their notebooks, but some stay to help carry paddles and pass bowls of stew. You watch the practical consequence of curiosity. Documentation, when done with humility, can be a bridge rather than a bell tower. For every report that winds up on a shelf, you hope a dozen copies return to the villagers. Or better yet, that the technical knowledge circulates in ways that support repair without rewriting rituals. The scholar's notebooks are small, patient instruments, measuring, recording, and occasionally learning to tamp in time. You close the day by giving a visiting student a small reed you still carry from the roofs. She grins and tucks it into her notebook like a talisman. In that private exchange, you see the best possibility of scholarship. It is a two-way handoff, a set of shared tools passed between study and everyday life, where paddles and pages change places and everyone ends the evening a little less lonely and a little more capable. You tuck that reed into your pocket and walk back, feeling part of a softer, shared future. You watch them arrive like a slow tide, backpacks bobbing, lenses catching light, and an audible mix of excitement and polite caution as strangers step into an intimate landscape. Tourists flow through alleys and courtyards with measured curiosity, pausing at painted lintels, framing a Toron, or leaning close to a weathered door as if they could read a story in the grain. Their presence is soft but tangible, less august than a new weather system folded into the village's usual climate. People notice posture, tone, and where a camera pauses. The village responds in turn, not always predictably. The camera is both translator and amplifier. It chooses what the outside world remembers. A mainstream historical fact sits between explanation and cliché. Travel narratives, from trans-Saharan caravan descriptions to later explorer accounts, have long shaped how outsiders imagine mud cities, and modern photography continues that lineage by curating what the world sees. A single striking image can become a village's calling card, redirecting attention, income, and expectation in ways that are sometimes generous and sometimes awkward. You learn to read tourist types fast. The quietly observant arrive with small packs and notebooks. They sit on a stoop and let a courtyard's rhythm enter them. Field photographers hunt texture and light, seeking the seam that flattens into an elegant frame. Then there are the performative visitors who climb onto thresholds for a staged portrait, as if the lintel were a stage and they the star. Joke 1. You keep a private mental leaderboard, seasoned pilgrim, to enthusiastic influencer, and award points for manners and for not stepping on a drying brick. Guided tours move like gentle choreography. A local guide, fluent in languages, shade finding, and the politics of polite permission, leads, pointing to a carved lintel, naming a mason, describing the annual replastering that turns repair into festival. The tour packages knowledge into tidy sentences for captions and brochures, useful and also limiting. Tours pay. A photogenic doorway can mean extra sales of woven mats or a request to demonstrate a carving. The guide helps stage moments that support incomes, and the procession of cameras becomes an income choreography as deliberate as any repair festival. There is an economy of appearance. Merchants learn to stage their stalls, indigo folds, cone-shaped piles of spice, and a tidy ceramic placed just so. Quirky tidbit. Some savvy stallholders keep a small kit of photo-ready props, fresh palm fronds, a bright cloth, an extra clean calabash, so that when a camera appears, they can instantly curate a scene. It is performance that pays. A single photograph shared widely can reroute interest and bring buyers from far-off towns. Joke 2. You imagine a stallholder offering hashtag InstaReady package with extra smiles and a complimentary palm frond. Photography changes craft subtly. Apprentices tidy corners when shutters click. Masons tuck tiny spirals into places that catch close-up light. Women touch up painted bands that visitors tend to linger on. The village performs in small ways, and you ask whether the changes are vanity, market-savvy pragmatism, or a mix of both. Historians still argue whether tourism primarily preserves practices by funding repair, apprenticeships, and festivals, or whether it turns living techniques into staged commodities that lose some of their context and durability. The debate matters because funding and fashion pull in different directions. Ethics arise in micro-negotiations. A tourist asks to photograph a child. A parent requests a printed photo or a small fee. A visitor wants an interior shot of the mosque. An elder asks for a demonstration of replastering first. Consent gets shaped into exchange. A smile plus permission, a token payment, or a printed image sent later. These micro deals rarely feel transactional in the worst sense, more like the village asserting terms for its own image. Yet sometimes a photo circulates to distant platforms without return or credit, and the people in the frame feel bared rather than honored. Tourism can fund maintenance when channeled thoughtfully. Print sales from an itinerant photographer can pay for lime, ladders, or a young apprentice's tools. A respectful tour can support apprenticeship stipends and keep repair festivals lively, but you also see the thin edge of imbalance. Grants that fund cosmetic whitewash to please postcards, but not the labor needed for structural care, or influencers who commission a mural and move on without contributing to long-term upkeep. The money is real. How it is used tells a story about priorities. Sometimes the camera amplifies folklore into commerce. That crocodile dung rumor, for instance, gets retold with theatrical delight because a leaning tourist with a big lens leans in. An elder tells the tale with a wink. The story photographs well and sometimes earns a small tip or a warding laugh. A rumor becomes a skit, and a skit becomes income. You note the double edge. Humor and myth can sell, and selling reshapes the myth. Children turn the exchange into play. They practice posing, coach visitors where to look for a hidden bead in a lintel, and invent treasure hunts where the prize is a token or a photograph. These games teach performance and negotiation as useful skills. They are practical lessons learned with laughter. Joke 3. You imagine a summer workshop where children issue Photo Etiquette 101. Certificates to visiting influencers complete with stern looks and a practical fee. Soundscapes shift too. The village percussion, the slap of a trowel, the soft scrape of a paddle, gains a new timbre. Shutter clicks and the hum of stabilizers. For a while, the mechanical chorus overlays old rhythms. Then the traditional sounds reassert themselves. The new noise becomes another instrument in a resilient orchestra that absorbs new layers and keeps playing. Not all visitors are outsiders. Diaspora returnees bring a different presence. Intimate curiosity mingle with remittances, family photographs, and a desire to document kinship. Their cameras repatriate images and memories. Their purchases and repairs are investments that elders invited. These visits often result in respectful collaborations. A grandson funds ladder repairs, a niece pays for lime. Together they record stories that stay where they belong. You also notice worrying patterns. A viral image may spotlight a single doorway so intensely that the household loses privacy and becomes a minor attraction. Or a well-intentioned influencer sponsors a mural for a momentary viral gain and leaves maintenance costs behind. Boundary questions emerge. How much daily life should be public, and who benefits when images travel across platforms? The village learns strategies. Some courtyards are designated photo areas with posted guidelines and modest fees. Others remain off-limits. A rotating schedule spreads the burden and the income so that no single household is always on show. Guides learn to ask for consent, to explain expectations, and to bring small returns such as prints or donations to apprentices. Curation becomes communal practice, an ethic of welcome and restraint. Sometimes the village takes control. A cooperative collects selected images and sells tasteful prints in a shared stall, splitting profits among families who consented to be pictured. A modest gallery, really a shaded alcove with a string and pins, lets locals choose which frames speak for them. Workshops teach artisans to digitize patterns into postcards so a visitor can carry a curated memory home without taking the life that created it. You also see generous tourism, visitors who fund an apprenticeship, buy lime, or sponsor ladder repairs. Those gestures matter. They signal respect and investment. The best outcomes pair curiosity with humility. A photographer learns to tamp a brick, an influencer listens to an elder's story, and a buyer commissions a carving rather than bargaining for a snapshot. By dusk, the last clicks fade. You stand on a step, thumb smudged with pigment, feeling the village tilt back to quieter rhythms. The tourist images will circulate and sometimes change things. Sometimes they stitch new threads into the fabric here. But the walls still need paddles, the Tehran still invites hands, and the pit where you mixed mud will be ready for tomorrow's batch. If the photos help keep ladders in place, then maybe that weather system is worth welcoming. You feel the first oddness in the air before you see the rain, a stillness that is too complete, as if even the dust has paused to listen. The sky darkens faster than you expect, and a small wind arrives carrying far-off thunder like a promise. In this landscape, the weather is not mere backdrop. It is a character that rewrites plans, tilts livelihoods, and on certain days tests the very seams of the houses you helped build. Today, the test arrives as a band of heavy clouds rolling up from the horizon. The first drops hit with a polite hesitation, as if the sky is asking permission. Then it opens. Sheets of rain pummel the packed earth, send rivulets down parapets, and probe patched joints with the patient insistence of an examiner. Water is both friend and critic. It brings relief during droughts, but it also finds weaknesses in plaster, softens thin edges and amplifies tiny cracks into wider problems. Buildings made of earth are porous, and that porosity is their advantage. Breathable walls that moderate humidity and keep interiors comfortable. Yet it is also the reason attention is never optional. A mainstream historical fact hums under your feet. The Sahel experienced severe droughts in the late 20th century, particularly from the late 1960s through the mid 1980s, which reshaped settlement patterns, agricultural practices, and social networks across West Africa. Those climate pulses left a legacy in construction choices. People learned to expect extremes and to make houses that responded to a variable sky. Drought years taught households to conserve straw, schedule replasterings carefully, and store essential materials in anticipation of seasons that sometimes fail to arrive on time. You climb a ladder and press a palm to a wall where water has been running. The plaster has softened at the edge, the sun-baked mantle turning slippery and unstable. Hands come to help. Buckets form a relay, tarps are lashed between Tehran beams, and someone shouts a quick instruction you follow without thinking. The work is improvisation with centuries of precedent. Tuck a reed mat under a vulnerable lip. Throw a thin coat of fresh mud into a seam, and the wall will resist another hour of rain. The choreography of rescue is almost gentle. Paddles passing, jokes thrown like lifelines, laughter layered over urgent taps. Floods test foundations in a different register. When rivers rise fast, sudden, and hungry, water wedges against base courses and undermines compacted footings. You have seen a low foundation scoured in a single season, walls leaning like apologetic monuments until masons rebuilt the base with larger stones and a ring beam that anchors better against scouring. Some communities raise thresholds and build low embankments, subtle earthworks that redirect sheet flow rather than letting it find the line of least resistance. Those small landscape adjustments read like local engineering, practical, precise, and often brilliantly low-tech. The human narrative threads through every hazard. An elder tells you how her grandmother moved sleeping areas to higher spaces during a remembered flood, and how that memory informs the family's layout today. These are not theoretical plans on a whiteboard. They are embodied calendars. Store grain high before the rains, replaster base sections in the late dry season, keep spare ladders at hand. Historians still argue whether adaptive features such as raised plinths, stilted storehouses, or particular drainage routines spread primarily by imitation, by migration, or by convergent invention across different communities. Yet, whatever the origin, their persistence shows they solve real problems. Droughts strike differently but with equal force. When the rains fail, clay pits harden, straw stocks shrink, and the ritual cycles that sustain mud houses, communal replasterings, ritual cleansings, harvest festivals, get postponed or canceled. The communal labor that maintains earthen architecture depends on agricultural rhythms. When fields demand every hand, roofs go unrepaired. You watch the calculus. Do you send your eldest to market for sacks of millet, or keep them at home to help patch a neighbor's ridge before the next wet season? Those choices are household arithmetic, and survival pivots on them. Quirky tidbit. In some villages, adaptive improvisations take whimsical forms. Families sometimes add crushed nutshells or ground shell to the slurry near a base to increase abrasion resistance, and others smear a narrow belt of ash at ground level because it seems to repel certain pests and encourages quicker drying after storms. Whether these tricks work consistently is a matter of local experiment, folklore, and gradual refinement. But such small innovations show how necessity and curiosity breed craft. The crocodile dung rumor surfaces here too, told with a grin, part myth, part experiment, and wholly characteristic of communities that test odd ideas and keep what helps. Erosion wears more than walls. It reshapes social geographies. When gullies cut across paths, children take longer routes to school and markets become less accessible. A cut in a track can turn a cooperative into an isolated hamlet, changing marriage patterns, trade timing, and who shows up for replastering day. The physical landscape and the social landscape braid together. A broken road is a break in reciprocity as surely as a cracked lintel. In hard seasons, distant labor migration increases. Young people travel to towns for wage work, and those departures alter who counts as neighbor and who shows up with ladders in an emergency. You notice the structural innovation seasons coax forth. Tehran beams are often more numerous near down-facing corners. Plinths receive a thicker composition of sand and small stone to resist splash erosion. Roofs acquire slight, intentional slopes to shed water toward planned channels, rather than allowing it to run across the top. A mason points out a subtle scaffold of stones at a foundation edge. The apparent improvisation is a durable tweak learned from repeated storms. Adaptive knowledge accumulates slowly through trial, failure, and the memory of hands that weathered a bad year. There are also contested interventions. Donors sometimes offer raised concrete plinths and cement collars to protect against scouring, and while these can be life-saving, they alter evaporation regimes and a wall's thermal dynamics. Cement collars may stop splash damage at the base but create a moisture trap, where the earthen wall above stays damp longer. Historians still argue whether such interventions, when introduced at scale, yield net benefits or accelerate hidden degradation over decades. Practitioners and engineers debate trade-offs in practical terms while elders measure outcomes season by season. Climate change adds a new scale of uncertainty. Weather that once followed predictable seasonal rhythms now occasionally delivers storms more intense than older generations recall, or long dry stretches that test grain banks and patience alike. People adapt with short-term improvisation, tarps, emergency replastering, sandbagging, and with longer-term strategies like diversifying livelihoods, planting drought-tolerant crops, or adopting hybrid building techniques that blend earth with reinforced elements. You hear worry in household conversations. A neighbor mentions how a storm last year came with wind force no elder remembers, and the story is told with both practical notes and a thread of awe. Community institutions act as resilience mechanisms. The social norms that organize replastering festivals also become channels for emergency response. Elders call work parties, women coordinate food, and young people fetch materials from storerooms. Mutual aid is often faster than formal assistance because it rests on trust and immediate local knowledge. You watch neighbors show up with buckets and chant a rhythm that keeps fatigue at bay. Even exhaustion finds steadiness in cadence. The cadence itself is a tool for endurance, a beat that turns heavy labor into a shared, bearable motion. Yet resilience has limits. Repeated storms can exhaust resources. A severe wet year followed by a long dry spell thins straw stocks and depletes savings. When households replace communal participation with paid labor, hiring masons rather than relying on mutual labor, the social fabric shifts and with it the capacity for rapid collective response. You notice how labor becomes a commodity. What was once repaid in stew and goodwill becomes a line item, and that change alters obligations and the speed of repair. In quieter moments, you find yourself mending a small seam, fetching a bundle of straw, swapping a pot of stew for a hand with a paddle. Those tiny labors are payments into a communal ledger. They circulate as favors, recipes, and stories, and they are the real insurance against seasons that behave badly. You stand at a repaired plinth, fingers pressed into fresh mud, feeling the coolness fade under your palm. Nearby, a child splashes in a newly formed puddle, laughing as if water is only ever joy. You think of old droughts and quick floods and how each season taught the village to read clouds, to stack grain high, to carry ladders at a moment's notice. Architecture here is porous not only in material but in practice. It breathes, it takes in error, and it asks for attention. Finally, you hear the elders' refrain, repeated at every season's edge. We build to be mended. It is not a defeatist motto but a promise. Maintenance is part of the life of a house. Joke 1. You imagine a homeowner's manual titled Plastering for Dummies, but written by a village elder who would simply say, Bring more people. Joke 2. You picture climate models politely asking for a paddle. Joke 3. You think of your city apartment and wonder whether its sealed windows are a comfort or a cage. Tonight the rain eases to a polite murmur. The village exhales, tarps drip, children count puddles, and you tuck a small stone into your pocket. A pebble for luck, or perhaps just a weight for a distracted hand. You walk past the pit and the drying bricks, feeling the ground firmer underfoot. The test is not over, but for now the walls have held. Repairs will continue tomorrow. That is how life here folds seasons into shelter. Dusk arrives like a slow, deliberate exhale, and you walk in the softened light with the kind of careful tread that feels like an apology to the day. The clay houses blur at the edges, their outlines softened into a low, gentle skyline where Tehran beams become the dark teeth of a comb against the dimming west. You breathe in air cooled by packed earth, and the heat that hollowed your shirt at noon is now only a memory at your collarbone. The world shrinks pleasantly to the scale of footsteps and small conversations, and you let your shoulders drop because the rhythm here insists on it. Sounds thin out into their essential threads. The last clatter of a pot, the whisper of a broom across packed earth, a child's muffled counting game in a courtyard, the low, patient hum of someone singing a line of an old work song. You follow that hum with the private grin. Remember the paddle rhythm at the mosque and the mixing pit? Because the village keeps a soundtrack of labor that later becomes lullaby. Joke 1. You imagine a Spotify playlist titled Paddle Beats Mud Mix Volume 1, and it somehow feels exactly right. You find a low step to sit on and watch courtyard life fold down into habits. A neighbor returns a ladder borrowed earlier with a bag of roasted peanuts as thanks. A small barter that feels rich in gratitude. Joke 2. You briefly consider launching Laddershare as a startup, but their economy of favors would likely undercut your business model. Someone smooths a fresh coat of mud along a base and the motion is practiced and economical. Short, outward strokes that feather new into old so that seams vanish. You learn that motion with a paddle in hand, and now it reads like muscle memory. The lights inside rooms are little warm coins. Doorways frame passing silhouettes, and sometimes a face tilts for a moment as if to check who that guest is. A woman mends a basket by lamplight, her fingers moving with an ease that could only come from decades of repetition. You think about how mundane gestures protect things of great consequence. Sweeping a threshold, collecting a stray reed, tucking a tarp under a corner. And you understand that maintenance is not occasional heroism, but tiny daily fidelity. Joke 3. The village would probably reject an app called Fix It Now. Stew is still preferred as currency. A mainstream historical fact settles into your awareness like soft dust. Communal maintenance, annual replastering, or coordinated patching after storms has long been central to earthen architecture across West Africa, and many towns organize collective workdays where neighbors climb ladders, pass bowls of mud, and sing while the walls are renewed. These are civic rituals that bind families, chart seasons, and keep structures breathing. Walking among these households, you witness how ritual and practicality interlace. Color and texture show up in the night as subtle signatures. You can still see the smear where a child once dragged his hand along a low wall, leaving a small glossy line that will become the subject of a later story. Quirky tidbit. Some villagers deliberately leave a thumbprint or an imperfect swirl in a seam, a tiny reminder that a human hand, not a machine, made this place. They say it confuses mischief and gives future grandchildren something to gossip about. You smile and run your finger along a faint, glossy trace, feeling like an accomplice to a small domestic prank. The market's distant murmur has dwindled, but you recall how earlier the day's barter set the village's tempo. Now the market's goods are tucked away, cloths folded, spice cones covered, and the indigo's deep stain left to sleep until morning. Tourists' cameras have retreated. Perhaps they caught the perfect shot of a painted lintel, or the mosque's Toron at sunset, and the images may ripple outward, changing what the village values. Yet here the governance of repair, who brings the ladder, whose stew feeds the crew, remains local and stubbornly practical. You stroll past a small shrine tucked into a courtyard niche and notice the pebble someone left there, a polite talisman that could be as much superstition as soil science. There are practices that blend both: a smear of ash at the base of a wall, a sprinkle of crushed shell in a plaster mix, even the whispered rumor, remember, about crocodile dung that supposedly lent stubbornness to certain mixes. Historians still argue whether such additives had consistent technical benefits, or whether they were symbolic gestures that encouraged communal care and experimentation. Either way, the stories surface in conversation and sometimes in trial. You think about the negotiations you witnessed earlier, scholars with notebooks and engineers with calculators, and how, at dusk, those debates soften into practical agreements. A planner's diagrams might become a knight's chat over tea. An academic's paper might be summarized to a simple request: help us fix the base before the rains. The important thing is that the conversation continues. You notice a graduate student from earlier helping pile a basket of fresh straw into a neighbor's cart. Hands-on transfer that feels like a tiny, tangible promise. The social economy of favors is visible in small redemption acts. Someone repays a loan with a basket of millet. Another returns a ladder with an extra coil of rope. You observe how obligations are tracked not on paper but in memory and gestures, and that system seems remarkably resilient. An elder mentions matter-of-factly that when he was young they kept a ledger of favors in song. Each verse lists a help repaid, and he sings you a line. The tune is complex, funny, and oddly precise. You hum it back poorly but with good will. Night vigilance is gentle and practiced. A neighbor does a slow walk around his compound, checking for loose stones and listening for drips. Someone else resets a low parapet that a goat nudged earlier. Slack ropes are tightened and bowls are inverted to keep rain from filling them. This is maintenance as nightly ritual. No permit needed, no contractor phoning in. just small acts of attention that accumulate into safety. You sense that this attentive domesticity is the real structural system here, more effective than any single engineered fix. The bricks on their drying racks catch the moonlight and look almost formal. Ranks of humble soldiers awaiting orders. You recall your own awkwardness at the pit, stomping, balancing, getting mud in places that made you wish for better footwear, and you laugh softly to yourself. The mud that once clung to your ankles is now a memory folded into these bricks' future solidity. You pat a brick gently, offering a silent thanks for the lesson in patience. Call back to the mixing pit and the mosque. Those cycles begin and end here in the same hands. As the moon climbs higher, narrative threads tighten into one clear feeling. This place is kept by 1,000 small attentions. You think of the whitewashed facades and the hybrid roofs you observed, modernity and tradition negotiating in plastered seams, and you accept that both can coexist if people choose repair over abandonment. The making of home here is less about materials than about daily promises. Show up, be seen, return a ladder, bring stew. It's a covenant more durable than any synthetic coating. You stand to move on, pausing to take in one last piece of domestic theater. An old woman smoothing a lintel with a practiced wrist, an apprentice watching like a student of the sun, a child asleep with a small stone on his chest, as if it keeps dreams balanced. You feel the day's dust in the fabric of your clothes and the village's cadence in your chest. Slower now, steady. Joke 4. You imagine the village applying for UNESCO status under the category Impossibly Low-Stress Maintenance Practices, and you smile at the idea. When you finally step out of the main lane, you look back at the gentle silhouette of the town. Toron beams, parapets, patched roofs, and you carry inward a sense of domestic wisdom. That architecture in its most humane form asks for tending rather than awe. You walk home with the careful pace of someone who has been given a small, generous curriculum in how to keep a world from falling apart. The night is quiet but not empty. It hums with readiness for tomorrow's work and with the soft knowledge that people and places, when tended, endure. Now, as the night thickens gently and the village folds into its habitual hush, you notice how small, repeated care becomes the architecture of comfort itself. Let your breathing match the slow rhythms you have learned here. Inhale with the memory of warm mud beneath your feet. Exhale the day's excess and allow the muscles that held paddles and ladders to loosen. There is nothing spectacular in this moment, only steady, ordinary things being done well, and that ordinariness offers its own kind of quiet blessing. Feel your shoulders melt a fraction, feel the day's tightness loosen like dried plaster softened by water. Let images fade at the edges, the Tehran beams, the drying racks, the courtyard's warm coin of light. Each detail blurs kindly as you choose which ones to keep. There is comfort in the ordinary here. Repair is ritual, and ritual is reassurance. Your mind may still flicker to questions. The shape of future storms, the cost of a bag of cement, the debates you overheard about old ways and new. But set those thoughts aside. They can wait until morning. Tonight, give them space to rest. Imagine the sound of a single paddle laid down, the quiet that follows, the small collective patience that will turn the next day's work into steady progress rather than an emergency. You carry this village now as a slow pattern in your chest, not as a checklist but as a gentle map of how to tend things. Show up, help, return a favor, smooth a seam. As you inhale, collect warmth. As you exhale, let the world's sharp edges soften. If you wake uneasy, remember the slim, reliable things that kept the village whole. They are simple, human, enough. Sleep well tonight. Good night.